Yep.
Lord Pounceloth is now live, streaming Palworld, making my slaves work till death.
Alright, let's see. But every evil queen and prince died. Okay.
And they did. Her blood splattered on the wall and on the horses, and Jihu drove his chariot over her body. Then he went inside, ate and drank.
The most brutal sports
Most
in
brutal.
history.
Tamales.
There's really nothing like whacking a ball or two around with the bros. So much so that history has no shortage of sports in which you can do just that. But if you've ever wanted to have your frontal lobe caved in with a solid rubber ball, then look no further than the ancient Mesoamerican sport of Uyamalitzli, the oldest known sport in history that revolved around using a ball. Now, for you 90s kids like myself, images of the Mesoamerican ball game may throttle your thinker with fleeting images of the classic DreamWorks animated film The Road to El Dorado, which features a whole scene focused on the sport. The problem is there are a few inaccuracies with how it was portrayed, but all's forgiven since the bulk of the budget was put towards hips rather than history. Now, before someone slaps their Dorito powdered mitts on their keyboard with a comment correcting me for using the term ancient to describe the sport, it is ancient. Now sure, the Mexica or Aztec were still playing ball even after the Spanish showed them the conquistador in the early 1500s, but the earliest known evidence of Uyamalitzli actually dates all the way back to the Olmec around 1650
Defeat
BC.
the Boston brothers of
yeah,
the Eternal
pretty
Pyre
friggin'
Tower.
ancient. As far as the Olmec go, however, the only thing we really know is that they invented and played the game. Unfortunately, there's really no surviving historical evidence of any rules or anything. What we do know is that the game was played under the same basic premise as any future iterations as far as using these same rubber balls and courts, but beyond that, nothing. Jumping through the following 2,000 years or so, the game evolved across the many different Mesoamerican civilizations who were better record keepers, but the general idea was more or less the same. ball, court, walls, and hoops. Now, if one looks at the historical portrayals of the sport,
Why
you'd
am I
immediately
using this
assume that
guy?
the goal of the game was to get the ball through the hoop. And you'd be wrong. Kinda. And I'll get to that in a second. The Mayan version of the sport, called pits, peaked in play around the years 250 to 900 AD. The sport itself was similar to that of modern volleyball. In the center of the
work,
arena,
kid.
called the tlachtli, was a chalked line that divided the court in half. Although there were many variations of the sport, the most popular version required players to keep a ball in the air while passing it to the opposing team. A dense, heavy-ass, solid rubber ball that could weigh as much as 10 pounds. Hey, do you have 10-pound balls? Yeah. Why? Well, then how do you walk?
He freaking got you, dude.
Before you even humor the thought of you slapping around a 10-pound solid sphere like you know you couldn't, players were forbidden from using their hands or feet to keep the ball in the air. Instead, hips, legs, chests, and booty cheeks were required to slam that thing around. If the ball made it across the line and the other team failed to keep it airborne, your team got a point. Despite using basic protection like hip guards and knee pads, the rubber ball itself was a force to be reckoned with. The sheer momentum behind the ball was enough for players to find themselves sustaining broken bones,
Perfect.
being battered with bruises, and bleeding their own blood. Of course, the ball was not the only threat. While you were ducking and diving and dipping to prevent your opponent from scoring, you ran the risk of colliding with other players or slinging your skull into the solid stone walls that lined the arena.
call the hot
Colonial
spring
chronicler Diego Duran
Production assembly
specifically noted
line.
the particularly
Assembly
brutal
line.
injuries sustained in this sport.
I
He noted that
understand.
players were horribly bruised across their bodies, with some players even dying from repeated blows to their tummies thanks to internal bleeding and organ damage. Now, if a player did manage to get the ball into one of those ornately decorated hoop holes, that player's team was instantly declared the winner, no matter the current score. But this was very rare, so much so that anyone who did it was legitimately revered for
Cryogenic coolant.
years after the
Oh,
fact.
yeah.
Forever remembered as that one guy that put that ball through the hoop that one time. What a legacy. For the vast majority of the Mesoamerican societies across time, the sport was not only played for sport. In fact, there is a lot of historical evidence that points to societies like the Maya or the Mexica using the game for political means. As an example, Aztec Emperor Axayacatl wagered his riches against an opposing emperor's farmlands and lost. So there was also, of course, the gambling aspect of it. Spectators were known to risk all kinds of belongings, money, property, even their subjectively repugnant children. Outside of the degenerate lifestyle, there is a prevailing myth that losers were sacrificed for being losers. Yes and no. In the traditional version with two professional competing teams, this was never the case. They were simply professional ball players. Teams won and lost all the time. However, there is historical evidence in Aztec codices and Spanish documents that alluded to some societies forcing freshly enslaved prisoners of war to compete against a professional team. The slaves, of course, always lost, as the game was more of a symbolic and ceremonial kick in the dick. Those prisoners were then sacrificed shortly after, but they were already destined to have their
That's
chest
pretty
cavities
awesome.
violently fisted anyway, not exclusively because they lost a simple ball game. Oh well, more blood for the sun god. Hey, it's your favorite live action chat history here, making a rare appearance to give you something nice to look at.
Something else.
Just kidding. Using a single take and as little breaths as possible, I'm going to tell you about today's sponsor, War Thunder. Here we go. War Thunder is the most comprehensive vehicle combat game ever made, and you, yes, you can play it right now for free on your computer, Xbox, PlayStation, or even your phone. What do you do in War Thunder? Well, you hop onto about 2,500 different war machines of your choice. Drive tanks, fly planes, or sail ships, even though they have no sails. Most importantly, you can use your vehicle's arsenal to convert your
Drop
enemies
an
into a
electric
fine red
organ.
mist. You can use little pea shooters from a 1920 biplane or fire a whole friggin' volley of weaponized tactiles from your very own warship. Whoa, neat. Thanks to all the details, realistic graphics, and authentic sounds, you'll get sucked right into the action. Want to take the upper management approach and just have fun without working too hard? Then the simple and clean arcade mode is right for you. But if you're looking to sauce up your little fingies, then the simulator mode has you pulling all the thick levers and tender knobs you could ever want. What I like is that War Thunder is heavily optimized, so even if you're stuck playing on Grandpa's spare gambling computer, you can still trigger Pop-Pop's Vietnam flashbacks, even on the lower rigs. If that gets your juices flowing, then join the worldwide community of over 95 5 million players today. Use my stinky little links in the pinned comment and description below to download War Thunder for free. You'll even get the limited time goodies on PC and consoles, the Eagle of Valor Decorator, 7 days of free premium access, and 100,000 silver lions to get you started. War Thunder, it's free, so play it. Now, if you're a greasy-blooded Italian like I know I'm not, you're probably very familiar with Calcio Storico. Despite having the ability to use more than just their piggies, Calcio Storico translates to historic football. In reality, it's like a combination of rugby, non-American football, and friggin' bare-knuckle boxing. That's because you're allowed to beat the ever-loving caca out of your opponents to win the game. A quick side note, why the heck do we not get this sport for the World Cup? Instead, we have to watch dudes kick a ball back and forth for nearly 2 hours while they over-dramatically fall to their knees in Walmart for catching a gentle breeze across their ankles? Pretty pathetic. Anyway, the rougher and tougher sport of Calcio Storico reportedly takes inspiration from the ancient ball-slapping Roman sport of Harpastum, which itself was inspired from the ancient Greek sport of Feninda. The earliest traces of Calcio Storico itself begins in the late 15th century as an unregulated and chaotic throwdown in the streets of Florence, Italy. This version is very similar to medieval mob football, which, as the name implies, pitted whole towns of medieval European peasants against each other in a muddy mashup as they wrestled around for the town ball. Calcio, however, was usually played during festivals or other communal events where many Florentines and Floran adults from differing neighborhoods would pinch together their fingers and initiate a challenge. An alternate origin story claims that the sport of Calcio may have been used as a strength and agility training for young soldiers, but whether you were chilling in a town or killing for the crown, the game was played the same. The game was formally formalized by big bearded fajoule Giovanni de Bardi in 1580, transforming the commoner game into an aristocratic sport. He wrote the rules. 27 players on each team would be positioned within a field roughly 80 by 40 meters in size. For the Americans, that's about 80 by 40 meters in size. Oh yeah, and the whole field was covered in sand. Why sand? Well, besides being coarse and getting everywhere, sand is great for traction and absorbing energy when you fall to the ground. It's also great at soaking up the blood that will inevitably spill. Each team consisted of 15 forwards called corridori, which were your main fists on the field. There were also 5 scanciatori, or midfielders, 3 datori annanzi, which focused on possession progression, and finally 4 datori indietro. They were your goalkeepers. All you had to do was take the ball and get it in the opposing tent while defending your own. Oof, way too slow. Now you're down a few teeth, but you've got more. Now, before you try to signal the ref like a little bitch, what just happened to you was completely fair game. In their mission to score a goal, players were permitted to do anything and everything to chalk up one for the team. Punching, kicking, throwing, kissing, tackling, pinning down, all valid moves. Huh? What? Nah, I said kicking. The ball itself could be carried, passed, or kicked around the field. As a fun bonus, no substitutions were allowed. Every single player must fight through exhaustion and injury until the 50-minute game was over. Broken noses, busted eye sockets, shattered teeth, and racked ribs were very common. Now, of course, that's not to say that the sport was one big unregulated brawl. Each defensive or offensive maneuver needed purpose. You couldn't just walk up to Giuseppe and clock him in the jaw for no reason. Pizza pasta, think faster. The sport was the pride and joy of Florence for over 100 years before slowly fading into obscurity once the aristocracy focused on more artsy-fartsy forms of entertainment like opera and dancing. However, Calcio Storico was revived in 1930 and has since become an annual tradition, with the game being played within the heart of Florence, Italy, every single June. Seriously, why is this lukewarm brown bathwater version of this sport way more popular? It's just foul. Transitioning now from Greece to Greece, we have the downright brutal Pankration. What, you pronounced it pancration? You silly. This was an ancient, unarmed, all-out test of combative strength. That's because the name Pankration translates to all of power or almighty. Appropriately so, because competitors were giving it their all in the ways of beating the piss out of their opponents. Believed to have been invented by Greek demigod legends Heracles and Theseus as a means of defeating their enemies, Pankration was brought into the mainstream with its debut in the Greek Olympic Games in 648 BC. Many beefy bros fought tooth and nail in the games to prove themselves the superior warrior. The sport itself also yielded military benefits. Turns out that many ancient Greek soldiers would find themselves SOL if they were ever disarmed of their armaments. So being taught how to grapple and wrestle your enemy as a last resort would at least give you a literal fighting chance at survival. Pankration was most famously adapted by none other than those walking, bulging biceps known as the Spartans. They, of course, opted for the most brutal and violent form of the sport. You see, in the Olympic version, pretty much any maneuvers were allowed, save for two: biting and gouging. You were not allowed to sink your fangs into flesh, nor allowed to jam your thumbs into eye sockets. Yeah, the Spartans did not care about that. Their reasoning was that in do-or-die situations, you're gonna do whatever's necessary to not die. Ancient Greek writers, such as the famous Herodotus, documented the Spartans' remarkable abilities to thermop the floor with their enemies while being completely unarmed. Now, Pankration for sport rather than survival was a different matter. It was pretty much like mixed martial arts as we know it today, but with some slight differences. For instance, weight classes straight up didn't exist, so some 5'0" little chode could end up getting paired up against someone built like a brick shithouse. There were also no time limits. Matches continued on in perpetuity until someone formally surrendered or died. Thankfully, referees were on the sidelines to make sure that rules were being followed. If someone decided to cosplay as a pit bull and treat you like a tender newborn, the ref would jump in and give the violent violator a well-deserved whacking with a thin rod. Suffice to say that these fighters were no strangers to getting beaten within an inch of their lives. They would often find themselves held in full-on chokeholds or having their little fingers being bent backwards or broken. Ankles were forcibly twisted, tendons torn, elbows bent well beyond their normal range, and kneecaps gone obtuse. It was not pretty.
Inside of water.
Oh, yeah. I forgot to mention, to make the spectacle more spectacular, every participant had their dicks out. Yeah, the original Olympics were all done with dudes in the nude. Something about celebrating the human form or something. It's all well and good, but I'd be a tad hesitant to dangle my wangle out if some guy could potentially grab at my apples and provide me a textbook example of testicular torsion, which was a legal move, by the way. To no surprise, there's many well-documented instances of participants being sent across the river Styx as a direct result of the sport. Perhaps the most famous example was that of Arrhion. Already a two-time Olympic Pankration champion in 564 BC, Ari was ready to go for gold a third time, but he ended up getting more than he bargained for. After squabbling with his opponent for some time, Ari found himself trapped in a seemingly fatal chokehold. Unable to escape, he began losing blood flow and started to go sleepy by. Right before slipping out of consciousness, though,
a wild shield was
Arrhion
captured
found a
using
sudden,
poke caps.
desperate
Winners
surge of
revealed in
strength,
90s.
managing to get a hold of his opponent's foot and popping that sucker from its socket. The sudden and indescribable pain instantly snapped his opponent out of his headlock maneuver, but in doing so, Arrhion's neck was also snapped. Minus one ankle, the unknown opponent had formally surrendered as Ari's lifeless body flopped to the ground. He was dead. But that begs the question, did he win? You bet your olive-oiled balls he did. Despite being dead as a doornail, Olympic officials officially crowned a corpse as champion. Arrhion had won his third and final Olympic crown. Now carved into legend, a marble statue of the naked champ was erected in his hometown. It's actually still on display today at the Museum of Olympic Games in Olympia. Ironically enough, without a head. Oh boy, back to the Italians. You know, there's probably a lot of people out there that believe the best way to get out their aggressions is through violence, and they're probably either in a cell or in the ground. But history has taught us that the most effective way of settling your differences was through an iconic alls-out, balls-out brawl. You see, the city of Venice experienced escalated gang violence between two factions dating as far back as the late 13th century. You have the rowdy Eastern Castellani clad in red, and the boisterous Western Nicolotti donning black. Both sides consisted mainly of burly laborers such as shipbuilders, fishermen, masons, and blacksmiths. You also had other low-income professionals looking to get some licks in, like artisans and even merchants of Venice. If you prick me, do I not bleed? The two clans would clash in random throwdowns throughout the city streets, causing property damage and inadvertently dragging innocent bystanders into their cartoon fighting clouds. Whoop! I need to be more careful. So in 1421, sick of all the stabbing and grabbing, city officials pushed these saucy little spaghettis to instead duke it out on various bridges throughout the city. This shrunk down the inevitable skirmishes to concentrated pockets instead of the entire city's streets. Bridges were in open areas and over water, so potential property damage was minimized. Thus, the Venetian Bridge Wars began. Well, that doesn't sound like much of a sport, you might say, flaring your hairy nostrils. I'm getting there. Relax. The earliest instances of the Venetian Bridge Wars were more or less actual wars. They were highly disorganized, unregulated, and excessively violent, as street brawls tend to be. There were no rules. Armored combatants could arm themselves with clubs, swords, spears, pretty much whatever you had to smack, prod, or whack with a rod. To no surprise, many people got killed, which, in the eyes of the city officials, was a huge no-no. Sure, you could punch someone's teeth down their throat, but you weren't allowed to punch them 6 feet under. But apparently, there was no real rush because it took nearly 180 years for the Venetian Bridge Wars to introduce rules and regulations to reduce the number of fatalities. Let's reduce, not eliminate. Around the year 1600, the Venetian government banned any and all weaponry. Instead, if you wanted to dish out the pain, it would be with your own God-given damage dealers. Although it sometimes varied, a war would begin with a single champion from each side. They would go mano a mano as the crowds behind them eagerly awaited a victor. After a short scuffle, the opposing crowds collided like a wall of death at a Lamb of God concert. As for the rules, this was your basic game of King of the Hill. Fight back your opponents and establish territorial control. The game was over once one team had entirely forced the other side from the bridge. Since there were no walls or rails, combatants often found themselves flung into the waters below, but after a brief dip in the drink, assuming you were still conscious, it was time to get your slippery self out and back into the brawl. Your team needs you after all. Well, looks like you got clobbered by a roof tile, delivered first class to your ocular cavity from a nearby spectator. Yeah, this sport was one that tens of thousands flocked to see, surrounding the bridge high and low. After all, why get yourself into a rowdy rumble when you could just huck shit at people from a distance and face no real consequence? Cowards. Now, as for team sizes, they were whoever you could get to fight for you, so hundreds or even thousands of people could rush a single bridge in hopes of bringing glory to their side. But yeah, that glory came with a price. Fractured jaws, broken ribs, smashed skulls, inverted teeth, crushed limbs, all expected injuries from the fisting festivities. Despite the banning of weaponry, each event was still a healthy revenue bump for local undertakers. Venetian records detailed in Robert Davis's War of the Fists describe numerous deaths ranging from being crushed beneath the stampeding crowd to whacking one's noodle on the stone bridge as they fell, not to mention the inevitable drownings. So after centuries of what had become traditional acts of violence, the Venetian Bridge Wars finally took their toll. After a particularly savage scuffle on September 29, 1705, the High Council of Venice had called it quits, formally banning the wars and forcing the two sides to figure out some other way to vent their hatred towards each other. They would have loved Super Smash Bros. Thanks again to War Thunder for sponsoring the video. Remember to use my links below to get in on the action today and also claim your free vehicle decorator, premium access, and 100,000 silver lions. Alright, roll the outro.
Good video. Now, question is how to get up there, man.
That are wrong.
I don't think that's the right way.
This is probably one of the first things we all learned about in school when discussing ancient Egypt. Tens of thousands of slaves enduring endless hours of intense, forced physical labor while barely being fed or provided with adequate water. Drop a sack of sand, chisel something at the wrong angle, devout masochist, you're getting a whipping. Well, it's all poppycock. While there were slaves, they were mainly prisoners of war or household servants who tended to their landlords, but they weren't really part of the main labor force. Instead, laborers in ancient Egypt were conscripted using the corvée duty system, a way to pay off taxes through manual labor. According to the book The Pyramid Builders of Ancient Egypt, which discusses the pyramid builders of ancient Egypt, farmers were usually pulled from their laborious crop dusting for construction work whenever the Nile went all floody during the summer months. While the snobby rich upper class folk avoided manual manual labor by just paying off their tax burden, them smelly pores were tasked with construction of temples, tombs, and pyramids. Laborers who worked on the pyramids, as well as other large structures way back in the ancient times, were actually well provided for. This makes sense, as having a weakened labor force due to neglect or malnourishment, it doesn't really pay great dividends. Can't exactly move giant rocks when you're completely emaciated. Small villages have been discovered built specifically for housing laborers. These sites also contain various animal bones and plentiful bread jars showing a high quality diet.
they're way
But of
up
course,
there.
the system wasn't perfect. Thanks to some classic upper class corruption, sometimes things didn't always go right for these
How am I
laborers, but
supposed to
they
get up
had the
there?
power to stand their ground. Dating all the way
like
back
there's
to
a way,
1170 BC, written evidence has been found of
Yeah.
an artisan's strike while constructing a tomb for then pharaoh Ramesses III. The artisans complained about a lack of promised rations and outright refused to
had
continue
a-
their work, dropping their chisels and their hammers to march right up to the ruling class's temples
Flying
to make their
Pokemon.
demands. What do we want? Food! When do we want it? Food! After chit-chatting with the local vizier, the workers were able to secure the
We
rations
want
and continue their
food.
work. Now, don't get me wrong. The labor that these guys endured was backbreaking, extremely strenuous, and downright exhausting. But they weren't outright enslaved or mistreated, as historians previously thought. We've all heard the legends about King Tut's tomb, right? If you disturb an ancient king's burial grounds, you'll be cursed, doomed to die a horrible death. Well, it's not so. You'd probably cough a bit from inhaling millennia-old mummy powder, but that's about it. Now, there has been evidence of some ancient tombs
Mummy
inscribed with
powder.
curse-like carvings.
Thing that
For
I
example, ancient warlord and Egyptian noble Ankh-Tifi wrote that, quote, "Any ruler who shall do evil or wickedness to his coffin, may the gods not accept any goods he offers, and may his heir never inherit." Similarly, an inscription on the tomb of 10th century BC ruler Kentika Ikeki warns that any impure men who enter this tomb, there will be judgment. An end shall be made for him. I shall seize his neck like a bird, and I shall cast the fear of myself into him. Now, in a culture that was super superstitious, anyone coming across warnings like that would be like, "Oh shit! A ghost!" prompting them to 180 right out of the room. When King Tut's tomb was discovered in 1922, no such written reprimands or warnings were ever found. In reality, the rumor of King Tut's curse revolves around one George Edward Stanhope Molyneux Herbert, 5th Earl of Carnarvon, a rich English white dude who funded the whole expedition that led to the discovery of the Sandy sarcophagus. He died a whole 4 months after the opening of the tomb. After which a journalist did what journalists do and printed a whole bunch of sensationalized fake news, attributing Lord Carnarvon's death to an
It's not
inexplicable
touched yet,
curse. To no surprise, the media ran with it, making claims of a written curse being uncovered with the tomb, though this never happened. So how
Brother.
did Lord Carnarvon die? He done got bit by a mosquito. The resulting bump was accidentally slashed while he was shaving, making a pretty nasty cut that later got infected. The old chap died of blood poisoning at the age of 56. Dedicated believers have tried to attribute other deaths to the curse, but they're really grasping for straws. Of the 58 people who were present at the opening of the tomb, only 8 had died within a dozen years of the discovery, and by various means ranging from cancer to murder to natural causes. The majority of the men went to live on full, healthy lives. At least they didn't steal any spooky slabs. That might have been a different story. When you think of Spartans, you probably think about them slippery, shiny hunks of warrior man meat as portrayed on the silver screen. A society of strict and viciously trained bloodthirsty warriors who could decimate any opposing army. But while you're thinking about oiled up, shirtless, muscular men, you might question if this portrayal is historically accurate. It's not. In reality, the Greek city-state of Sparta had no professional army. Although growing up with militaristic training, the purpose was not to create warriors, but perfected, hardened, and respectable citizens who could serve to defend their homeland if need be. That little element of perfection is where some rumors of Spartan eugenics come in. It is believed that ancient Spartans practiced infanticide, the act of killing deformed or undesired babies as a way to strengthen the Spartan society. However, the biggest downfall of this myth is that there's only one historical source that alludes to this barbaric practice, and it's this guy, Roman historian Plutarch. He wrote that Spartan elders would examine newborns for imperfections or weaknesses. Good, good, bad, good. What the?
Hello, Daddy.
Ew. If any were ever found, they would just yeetus the fetus off the Taygetus mountainside. This ensured that only the best of the best would be able to thrive to crushing adulthood. But this bit of literature is almost certainly a bunch of baloney. While historians can't confirm with 100% certainty, they can confirm with 99.9% certainty that this just flat out never happened. Excavations around the proposed baby hucking sites have failed to present any supporting evidence. There have been a few adult remains discovered, but no teeny tiny toddler tibias were ever among them. If you needed more convincing, Plutarch's writings date some 600 years after the height of Spartan civilization. So it might have just been some silly Spartan slander. That would be like if future archaeologists in the year 4000 unearthed fan fiction from today about how medieval Europeans would just shit their britches to ward off witches. Sure, it's questionable, but you could kind of see that happening, right? Despite what you may think, death was not the goal of gladiator battles in the Roman Colosseum. If it was, Rome would have run out of them real quick. Now keep in mind that the Colosseum was active for over 400 years, hosting a plethora of different events ranging from gladiator battles to public criminal executions to full-fledged naval battle reenactments with the entire Colosseum being flooded. Pretty wild, right? Well, gladiator battles were basically the equivalent of today's UFC or boxing matches, just with swords and spears instead of fists. These fights were spectacles of sport, and the gladiators were the athletes. You had some super famous gladiators, rookie gladiators, and everything in between. While some gladiators were slaves, criminals, or prisoners of war fighting for their chance of freedom, most of the big old brutes fought for fame and fortune, or just the high-octane dopamine rush of being able to legally stab someone in the kidney and getting praised for it. Roman citizens were hyped to watch two dudes duke it out in a sweaty, sandy, sassy struggle of strength. But things were a lot more exciting than just the vanilla missionary position 9-to-5 white picket fence 1.5 children ass sword and shield type gladiators. Nope. Actually, there were about 30 different types of gladiators ready to clang and bang away at each other. You had your dual-wielding demon Iris, the trident-chucking Ricciarius, the silly-looking Caesar, and the alls-out, balls-out Cestus, among other DLC characters. So imagine that you're living your boring Roman life, sitting in your boring Roman house, scratching your boring Roman balls when you suddenly catch wind of the gladiator battle of the century. Two andabate pitted against each other. You'd lose your shit. Why would you lose your shit? Because andabate were condemned criminals fighting each other completely blind. Yeah, as a form of punishment, two criminals equipped with nothing more than a sealed helmet and a rusty sword were dumped out into the arena and forced to square off. It's like watching two blindfolded kids trying to whack at a piñata, except they're both potential piñatas. Now, while formal gladiator duels were not to the death, of course some still died, but it was more common to die by bleeding out after the match had been called by the referee.
The other guy.
Oh yeah, they had referees. These were often retired gladiators tasked with making sure that the rules of battle were being followed and stopping fights before final blows were dealt. See, gladiators were expensive investments, so their managers wanted them alive for as long as possible, plus they start all over leveling up another rookie from scratch. So with all that being said, professional gladiator battles were not performed for the sake of death, just for the thrill of the fight, and the potential of death.
Gold.
Ancient myths are tough for modern historians to interpret, as historical writers across time have their own
A wild
biases.
Hydruple appears
Depending on
captured
how they
using
felt
poke
about a
catch.
certain historical
Winners revealed
figure,
in 90s.
they could cement their legacy in history as
Well,
a smart fella or a fart smeller.
Stuff is gone
The
now.
prevailing myth that Roman Emperor Nero diddled his fiddle as Rome burned to the ground is one that should go up in smoke. It's commonly believed that Nero, having descended into madness over the course of his reign, started the Great Fire of Rome in 64 AD, a disastrous and destructive inferno that destroyed nearly 3/4 of the Roman capital. Accusations claim that Nero didn't really like the look of Rome and wanted to rebuild it in his own vision with a lavish and gaudy golden palace.
Who wants to
So a
make
conveniently
babies?
timed fire would have been a great opportunity to do so. The fire is suspected to have started in a shopping district stockpiled with flammable goods. Once the fire started, it was nearly impossible to contain. Rome was a dense city,
Big boy,
streets were
you're getting in
narrow,
there.
housing structures were wooden, and the wind was a-blowin'. This set of conditions provided the perfect environment for the big old fire to really roar.
Wait, I
The
chose
blaze
the
lasted
wrong
for
guy.
9 whole days, decimating 10 of Rome's 14 districts. But was Emperor Nero to blame? Not at all. According to
this guy
Tacitus,
here.
one of the most influential Roman
Oh,
historians
John, I
at the
need you.
time, Nero was not near Rome when the fire started. He was actually several miles away in the coastal town of Antium, but he rushed back home to Rome once he caught wind of the disaster. When he did get back, Nero actually funded relief efforts and opened up private gardens and other structures for shelter to those affected. Despite these efforts, Nero still came under scrutiny from the
Wait,
nobles who
take you
hated
away,
him,
man.
claiming that he should have responded sooner
Hydruple
and
escaped.
provided more
No
assistance.
one caught it.
Freaking Nero, dude. I bet my scorched ass
Freaking
cheeks he
hell.
started that fire himself. Yeah, you're right. He probably did.
No,
Guys,
what are you doing?
was literally miles away in another city.
What did you do?
And that's how rumors start. In actual fact, there is no historical evidence that Nero started the fire, and especially no evidence that he played the fiddle when Rome burned. Mostly because the fiddle wouldn't be invented for another 900 years. It's probable that the claim is part of Christian propaganda, as Nero famously blamed them for the fire, leading to their persecution.
Talia.
So who really got
Talia
the last laugh? It was Nero.
male
He
here.
burned a
So.
lot of Christians.
Baby, just come on.
It's possible that your middle school history textbooks may have toyed with the idea that ancient Aztecs, or even the greater Mexica people as a whole, saw the invading Spanish conquistadors as godlike figures. More specifically, history has suggested that the Aztec ruler Moctezuma, or Montezuma, however you want to pronounce it, believed that the arrival of the Spanish coincided with the prophesied return of Quetzalcoatl, the Mesoamerican feathered serpent god of creation. But we now know that it's all, as the Spanish say, a bunch of caca. It's certainly true that the native Mexican people were stunned and confused by the appearance of the foreign invaders with their fancy horses, gunpowder, and white skin, but there's no evidence explicitly stating that they were thought of as gods. Letters written by Hernan Cortés himself about his conquests never mention being mistaken for or being interpreted as a god in any way, shape, or form. And this is further supported by the writings of Spanish conquistador Bernal Diaz del Castillo, who chronicled Cortez's conquests in real time.
Not yet.
One passage highlights a conversation between
saddle
Cortez and
for
Moctezuma in the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan. Conversation basically had Moctezuma being like, yeah, people around here think I'm a god, that I'm all about gold and silver and precious stones, but look, you see that? Flesh and blood, my dude. We're both the same. I know that you're just a bunch of foreigners and not some otherworldly divine beings. That would just be silly. To which Cortez replied, so where did this idea come from? Well, it actually started to surface decades after the Aztecs were conquered. Publications of Spanish conquests alluded to the idea that Cortez and his men tried to pass their weapons off as magic and their horses off as intelligent, aggressive beasts. So it was mainly a sensationalized retelling of events, portraying the Mexica people as more feeble-minded, all while embellishing the Spanish image. As it turns out, the Aztec weren't bamboozled by some distrustful deity. The Spanish completely steamrolled the Aztec with the help of guns, alliances to Aztec rivals, and every European explorer's iconic weapon, disease. It was less,
Fucking hell, how do I get
and
electric
more,
organs? I know how.
The Great Depression was truly a financial disaster, not only for the US, but for the entire globe. Most of you out there might recall learning that the stock market crash of 1929 caused the Great Depression.
I need a
In
third
reality,
spot for
it was
just
just a signal that shit had hit the financial fan. Nothing more than a devastating
bombing,
effect
man.
from a much more threatening underlying cause. If you're
Oh, it's
unaware,
fine,
the world
follow
economy
me.
is a constant struggle for balance of supply and demand, with price being the end result. Lots of demand and no supply, prices go up. Lots of supply but no buyers, prices go down. Sure, that's a bit oversimplified, but you get the idea. The Great Depression was a catastrophic chain of events stemming from U.S. overproduction of goods. You see, in the early 1920s, the world had entered a time of peace at the end of World War I.
So I
This led
got
to
my
an industrial
inventory,
boom.
by the way.
Not for war machines, but for consumer goods. Mass production was going wild, and factories were farting out new products like crazy. To sell these products, companies began aggressive advertising campaigns. The news, radio, magazines, and everything just screamed in your face to buy the latest and greatest doohickey.
That's shit.
And the people did. But how could customers afford all of this lavish spending? Yep, the establishment of consumer credit. Cars, appliances, clothes, homes, all purchased on credit. But the United States was not the only beneficiary of a peacetime
Let's
economy.
just explore, I
European and
think.
Asian markets began producing their own goods, selling these products to the US for cheaper prices, which caught the eyes of consumers looking to save a few pennies here and there. The big American companies, seeing potential profits leaving their grubby hands, were pissed and lobbied Congress to protect their interests. In order to do so, the Fordney-McCumber Tariff of 1922
And why
was
did I have to
passed.
die there? Why did I
This
have to
raised
die?
American tariffs across the board,
Nibbles.
increasing the consumer cost of foreign goods as to
That thing
thin
is,
out
I
the
don't have any-
competition and force Americans to buy American products.
Nibbles
Europe and Asia
captured.
promptly responded in kind, and soon a tariff war commenced. All this sounds a bit familiar, doesn't it? Now, in order to keep a
Now,
super
where
long
are the
story super
bees?
short,
I need the
here's what
bees.
happened next. Demand shrank as American companies and farms
I don't remember
overproduced their
what it
goods.
spawned.
Too much stuff and no one to buy it means less sales. Less sales means less profit for these companies, and with less company profit, that means they're going to start handing out some pink slips. With lots of people laid off, lots of people have less money to spend, so companies lose even more money. And if they lose enough of it, they go bankrupt. Now, when companies went bankrupt, at least back in the 1920s, the banks that supported them failed. And when the banks failed, people's money straight up vanished, thanks to the lack of FDIC insurance. Everyone loses their shit and rushes to withdraw money from whatever banks are still standing, but there's not enough physical cash to meet that demand. Now, all of a sudden, no one has money. So what happened to it all? The banks lent it out to all the rich people, placing speculative bets on the stock market. Now, when there's a lot of market speculation, stock market prices get unreasonably high. Unreasonably high prices aren't very sexy, so no one else wants to buy them. Instead, they sell to take profits. But when these profits are taken, that stock price drops. When stock prices drop, any remaining shareholders lose potential profit, which is no bueno. So they panic sell whatever shares they have. And when there's enough seller momentum across the board, the entire stock market crashes. So banks have failed, blue-collar workers have lost their life savings overnight, millionaires have lost their fortunes, factories have folded, and farmers have hung up their tools. Not only did this cripple the United States, but the entirety of global trade. The United States could not meet critical export demands, and foreign economies selling raw materials such as sugar, rubber, and lumber lost their biggest customer, and thus most of their money, impacting their economies. The Great Depression was without doubt one of the worst economic disasters of the modern age. The American economy struggled until the United States entered World War II in 1941, where demand for production and labor picked right back up. To put it simply, the 1929 stock market crash did not cause the Great Depression. It was the writing on the wall that the system was breaking. Afterward, the banking system was overhauled and the stock market heavily regulated to prevent history from repeating itself.
You know what? Just
We'll
killed
see
him,
how
man.
that goes.
Oh.
Well, that's the end of this video. Did you learn something new? I hope so. Want to see a part 2? I hope so. Let me know in the comments. Until then, here's another video. I'll see you over there.
I think I've overthrown it a bit. Be honest, this
If you can oil up your whiskers, you can lubricate the political machine. So it goes without saying that cosmetology and political science are of equal value. At least from a college degree standpoint. However, Hans's biggest asset would be his downfall, quite literally. On September 28, 1567, a fire broke out in the town, which was a much bigger threat back then than it is today. Since the extent of firefighting tactics were just pathetic pails of water, a single small fire could reduce your whole town to cinders real quick. Hans, who usually tucked his beloved beard into a leather pouch for safekeeping and uninhibited travel, let his lusciously long locks whimsically whip in the wind as he ran to help with the fire. Scuttling down some stairs in a panic, Hans had accidentally slammed a piggy right on his own facial pubes, causing him to slip and trip down the entire staircase.
Press E. I'm so mad. I'm dead.
He snapped his neck, and the town was devastated. Not by the fire, but by the loss of their beloved mayor. Before being buried, the townsfolk had Hans's beard gently removed and chemically preserved, immortalizing his legacy. The forever facial hair is still on display in a museum in the town today. You know his ghost is pissed, though. Ever have an extreme case of the sleepy ha-has where you find anything and everything to be complete comedic gold to the point of not being able to even breathe? What? Now try to imagine this soggy scoop of Cheerios doing that. This is Chrysippus, a rather influential Greek Stoic philosopher in the 3rd century
I heard about
BC.
this story.
In case you don't peruse that corner of YouTube, Stoicism is the philosophy that you only ever need to focus on what you can control in your life. Anything reasonably outside of that control, Hakunas Matatis, not my problems. Which is a pretty solid philosophy, especially in this age of doom and gloom social media designed to make you perpetually paranoid and pissed off. Chrysippus was also a huge proponent of logical reasoning, having created an original system of propositional logic, stuff like if, then, and or statements that we use to describe the world around us today. For example, if you are not subscribed to this channel, then you're dead to me. Simple logic. The basic idea is that any and all things happen for a reason. Well, I'm sure Chrysippus would have a hard time understanding the logic and reasoning surrounding his rather untimely death. According to legend, Chrysippus, at the fermented old age of 73, got trashed at a feast. In his slizzard state, he had stumbled upon a donkey who was munching on some figs. Registering at least a 6.9 on the ancient Greek comedy scale, the masticating mule was a hilarious sight to behold, prompting Chrysippus to exclaim, quote,
"Now give the donkey some pure wine to wash down the figs."
This added punchline sent the Lord of Logic over the edge. Chrysippus reportedly hurled himself into a fit of laughter so intense that he had collapsed, foaming at the mouth. Despite some nearby partygoers attempting to help him, he had knocked himself dead with his own joke. But the question is, can you actually die from laughter? Sure you can. It's rare, but medically possible. If you laugh your ass off to the point of it being an uncontrollable fit, that actually puts a lot of stress on your heart. So if you have a weak heart, you're probably going to exacerbate some underlying conditions, leading to a heart attack. You also have the possibility of losing consciousness if you laugh yourself out of breath for long enough. But you have to hear or see something exceptionally funny for that to happen, so don't worry, you're safe here. Now, of course, this recount of events is debated by historians. The guy who documented this particular death was ancient Greek biographer Diogenes Laertius, who lived a few hundred years after Chrysippus' death, so he was far from an eyewitness.
Diogenes nuts!
On top of that, he also wrote an alternative, more mundane account of the comical death, simply writing that Chrysippus died of alcohol poisoning after drinking too much undiluted wine, but I guess he needed to spice some things up for his readers. If there was ever proof that the universe has a cruel sense of humor, then it's the curious case of American lawyer and politician Clement Vallandigham.
Howdy.
Though he resided in the Union state of Ohio during the mid-1800s, Clement was adamantly against the Civil War, calling it, quote, a wicked, cruel, and unnecessary war. Which is fine, but being a member of the Copperhead faction of the anti-war Democrats, Clement was a very vocal Confederate sympathizer, speaking out against President Lincoln and the abolition of slavery, to which Lincoln was all and sent him to the South to live amongst his Confederate companions in 1863. Clement, who was clearly not about that life, snuck aboard a ship and shipped himself off to Canada before sneaking back to his home state of Ohio to perform rather inconsequential political mumbo-jumbo for the next few years. But after the war was over, Clement attempted to run on political platforms while still advocating for slavery. However, he suddenly switched his views with the Democratic New Departure policy of 1865, which basically 180 the Democratic Party's stance on slavery once they realized that it fell out of favor in the public's eye. So, being branded as a no-good slavery supporter for life meant the figurative death of his political career. Instead, he turned to a career in law, which would soon lead to his literal death. On June 17, 1871, Vallandigham met his demise while defending his client, Thomas McGeehan, a young fella accused of shooting and killing one Tommy Myers. Clement claimed that Myers had, in fact, not been murdered, but accidentally shot himself with his own gun while getting up to stand. Clement vowed that he could demonstrate this before the court, proving McGeehan's innocence. And so he did. Now, when reenacting a scene that results in someone accidentally blowing a hole through their own tummy, you want to make sure that you have safety measures in place that would physically prevent you from doing the same thing. Clement didn't do that. Instead, he had mistakenly used a loaded pistol. While demonstrating the scene as Myers, Clement attempted to draw the seemingly harmless firearm from his coat pocket as he stood up. And he blew a hole through his own tummy, just like Myers.
A wild
Clement
Palmer is
Vallandigham
captured
died
using
just
Coke
12
Catch,
hours later
winners
from his
revealed in
injuries.
90s.
The verdict? Not guilty. McGeehan was acquitted and was a free man. Until he was murdered a few years later, that is.
My God.
You can tempt death all you like, but eventually, he's gonna get what's his. That's what big old Bobby Leach found out in 1926. Born in itty-bitty Britain, England in 1858, Leach grew up to be quite the daredevil. Unfortunately, most of Bobby's early life is lost to time, completely shrouded in mystery. We do know that around the 1880s, he had left boring old England for a more exhilarating life in the States. Apparently an excellent swimmer, Leach eventually landed a gig as a professional high diver with the greatest show on earth, the Barnum and Bailey Circus. There, he performed daringly dangerous feats in front of thousands of eager onlookers. This had quenched the adrenaline-thirsty void in his life for a while, but eventually he retired from this circus life at the age of 50 in order to extend his life expectancy a bit. But that logic was tossed aside rather quickly, as in the early 1900s, Bobby decided to settle down as a humble businessman at Niagara Falls.
I knew it.
Initially content with just opening up a restaurant, Leach noticed the ever-increasing tourists flocking from afar to see a bunch of water spill over a cliff. So, this gave him an idea. The Daredevil was
Palmer
back.
escaped.
Between
No one caught
1906
it.
and 1911, Leach performed various stunts around the falls, including parachuting from the nearby Honeymoon Bridge to the river below. Over the years, Leach continued to push the envelope, coming up with more and more dangerous stunts to draw larger and larger crowds. Eventually,
My
he faced his
God.
biggest challenge, the
Not getting
falls
help at
themselves.
all.
And on July 25th,
Not
1911, entombed in a customized giant metal barrel, Leach took the plunge. And survived. Sure, he had gashed his forehead, broken his jaw, and all of his kneecaps, but he was still kicking. Bobby Leach became the second person to survive the trip, right behind 63-year-old Annie Taylor. After recovering in the hospital for several months, Leach became a celebrity. Over the next several years, he had plans to make a second bound over the falls, but it never came to be. Why? Well, because in 1926, he went and slipped on a dang orange peel, snapping his leg in half, which went and got infected with gangrene, ultimately killing him a few days later. Remember that death always gets the last
90.
laugh.
I knew it.
Having served the shortest presidential term in United States history, you know something
Now
must have
any
gone
flying
down. Well,
Pokemon.
it was President William Henry Harrison's health bar. The withering president had a pretty impressive career before assuming office. He enlisted in the U.S. Army in 1791 at the age of 18 and quickly rose through the ranks, serving in the American Indian Wars, which sought to expand U.S. territory further west against native tribes. Which they did. Satisfied with his service, Harrison decided to retire from the military at 25 and toss his hat in the ring for a career in politics. Recognized for his leadership skills on the battlefield, then President Guy John Adams gave Harrison control over the territory of Indiana as governor, with the goal of expanding that territory for statehood eligibility. One consequence of this territorial expansion was the Battle of Tippecanoe in 1811, which only further displaced natives from the area in order to allow more settlers to, well, settle. This success cemented Harrison's legacy, as Indiana would eventually become its own state in 1816. But leading military campaigns from afar, that's boring as shit. Harrison missed being in the middle of the action,
Now, let's
so
see.
he came
We
out
have
from his
everything.
military retirement to fight in the War of 1812, serving as a major general for the U.S. Army
Here.
against the smelly redcoats, who weren't too happy seeing the U.S.'s throbbing expansion. A bunch of people died, and the war ended in pretty much a stalemate. But the
Pretty
outcome
much.
solidified
This
the
one I
U.S.
don't
as a
wanna
world
check
power,
out
being
yet.
able to at least defend itself from a foreign power.
Thoughts
This
done.
really boosted national morale and pride, and with no restrictions put in place, the U.S. just kept on manifesting
much
that destiny in the
stuff,
coming
man.
years. Now back in a
Holy.
time of peace and having successfully satisfied as a war boner, Harrison fell back into politics, serving in the House of Representatives, the Senate, and eventually
So much.
running for president. His opponent was 8th President Martin Van Buren, whose first term experienced an economic depression with the Panic of 1837. Of course, Van Buren was given the blame for the economic downturn, even though it began over a month before he
probably
was even in
if I
office.
go
The economy
here.
stagnated, unemployment rose, and the people were properly pissed. So it's no surprise that when seeking re-election, it was now Harrison who would be the favorite to win. Harrison won in a landslide, 234 electoral votes to Van Buren's 60. But that wouldn't matter in about a month. Elected in 1841 at the age of 68, Harrison was getting on in his years. Either a stubborn old goat or a complete idiot, he had the habit of being extremely underprepared for the weather. For example, he delivered his inaugural speech in the bitter cold and rain for 2 hours straight, with no overcoat or
He's
weather-appropriate
literally
clothes.
me.
Connected
holy.
with the subject is the character of the currency. The idea of making it exclusively metallic, however well intended, appears to me to be fraught with.
Oh, this is gonna suck. Harrison continued to endure exposure to the elements over the next few weeks, eventually contracting a deadly case of pneumonia. Despite his doctors jacking him to the tits with drugs and relying on good old-fashioned
That's what
bloodletting,
I'm doing at the
Harrison died on
moment.
April 4th, 1841, exactly
Medicine,
1 month after being
Get
elected.
healthy until Monday, man. We're there.
When you were a kid, did you ever try jumping off of a sofa using a blanket as a makeshift parachute, but you failed to calculate if the blanket had the proper
Frozen.
coefficient of drag necessary to minimize your acceleration due to gravity, leaving you crashing to the floor in a possible concussion? Just me? Well, take that scenario and scale it up to adult size. Except this is your blanket, and this is your couch. Meet Franz Reichelt, the mastermind behind the
What a
parachute suit
badass.
prototype. An Austro-Hungarian tailor and inventor, Franz became hyper-fixated on developing a sort of wearable parachute. He had identified a gap in the market with the rise of humanity's newest invention, the powered aircraft. Seeing reports of pilots forced to launch themselves out of their airborne contraptions if things went south, Franz vowed to come up with a solution to save lives. So he got to work in 1910 with some initial designs, testing the prototypes by strapping them onto makeshift dummies and hucking them off of a 5-story ledge. Surprisingly, the dummies managed to hit the ground at less than fatal speeds. Not bad. But there was a problem. The prototype weighed 150 pounds. And no pilot's gonna lug all that extra weight onto an aircraft, even if it would potentially save their life. But Franz would not give up. After all, you have to fail many times before you succeed. But it did help that there was also some monetary encouragement. Turns out that France's Aeronautic Club held a parachute-esque design competition which offered a cash prize to the tune of 10,000 francs. Considering that the average wage of an unskilled French laborer at the time was only a few francs a day, that prize was nothing to sneeze at. Over the next year, Reichelt was unable to replicate his initial success with any of the later redesigns. But to his logic, it wasn't a design problem, it was a height problem. Anyone who has even taken a basic physics course knows that this is a bad idea. You fall exponentially faster the longer you're airborne thanks to acceleration due to gravity. But what's a bunch of stupid science shit gonna do to stop an avid inventor from fulfilling his dream and lining his pockets? Nothing. But the pavement will. But Franz, determined to test his designs from a higher height, pleaded with the Parisian Prefecture of Police to allow him to run an experiment from the Eiffel Tower. Despite numerous rejections, they eventually gave in. On the bitter cold morning of February 4th, 1912, and to the surprise of everyone, Franz arrived on site in his dumpy-looking parachute suit. Now, the police only gave Franz permission to perform this stunt on the grounds that dummies would be used, not that he would be doing the jumping himself. This guy was so confident in his invention, boasting to news journalists of how successful it was gonna be. But apparently the police didn't feel like stopping him, so after a bunch of preparations, Reichelt made the leap, but his parachute suit failed to properly deploy, so the poor fella plummeted 187 feet to his death, achieving nothing but a front-shaped dent in the cement.
Killed him.
It's near the end of 1938, and deep in the confines of Berlin, Germany, a couple of nerds are about to discover a discovery that will change the world forever. Chemists Otto Hahn and Fritz Strassmann were enjoying the traditional German pastime of bombarding uranium with neutrons in hope of something interesting to happen. After a few sauerkraut sandwiches, Hahn and Strassmann checked the results of their experiments and discovered that they had performed nuclear fission, which is the act of splitting a larger atom into smaller atoms, releasing a ton of energy in the process. Kind of like a bomb.
So third place we could.
But there's a bit of a problem. You see, this isn't just Germany, this is 1939 Germany. You know, Nazi Germany. And nuclear fission sounds like it would make a pretty effective weapon. German-American physicist and local Nazi hater Leo Szilard was worried Strassmann and Hahn's discovery would fall into the wrong hands, so he knew he needed to warn the Allied nations. So he wrote a letter to United States President Franklin D. Roosevelt that basically said,
Bro, they're not building bombs like big bombs, nuclear bombs, so maybe you guys should build them first. I don't know, just thinking out loud, P.S. your uranium sucks.
The letter was even signed by famous scientist Albert Einstein, so that Roosevelt knew to take it very seriously, which he did. With some prodding from British scientists, Roosevelt approved a program on October 9th, 1941 to assess the feasibility of an atomic bomb using uranium. So sometime later, the committee of the program came back to FDR and said, we might be able to do it, but we need like $50 to $100 million maybe? Roosevelt scratched his chin and contemplated moving forward, but was ultimately convinced when a bunch of very American boats were blown up by very Japanese planes. On August 13th, 1942, theory would be engineered into reality with the start of the Manhattan Project, which pushed forward the physical development of the world's first nuclear weapons. Such an ambitious project certainly needed an equally ambitious leader, and there was only one man for the job. That's right, the Manhattan Project was under the direction of none other than Leslie Groves Jr., a decorated and well-respected United States Army Corps of Engineers Lieutenant General. But he also needed someone to lead the secret weapons laboratory. So here enters the star of our story,
Theoretical physicist J. Robert Oppenheimer, a strictly conservative Nobel Prize-winning scientific leader. Except
was
he
okay.
wasn't. To the United States government, Oppenheimer was a filthy commie sympathizer. He had never won any notable awards, nor had he led any major scientific breakthrough projects. But like a shonen anime main character, he had drive and ambition like no other, and Lieutenant General Groves knew that determination would guarantee the success of this project,
great.
so Oppenheimer got the job. Great, but now they had to actually build the lab, and what's more remote and secure for a secret base than in the middle of fuckbuck nowhere, New Mexico? Now set with a location, Oppenheimer then assembled his own Avenger squad of some of the most brilliant physicists at the time in the spring of 1943, placing himself as the Captain America of the group.
Is that the
To keep
thing I
everyone living
need?
together harmoniously during the project,
the
the
one
town
I
of Los
need?
Alamos was erected practically
Could be.
overnight. Now, the race was on to beat the smelly Nazis to the finish. With such a high-pressure project, it wasn't uncommon for everyone on staff to frequently worry that Germany was going to beat them to the punch. But Oppenheimer was a natural leader. He was constantly present in every meeting, discussion, and critical moment during the project, ensuring that morale was always maxed out. By July 1945, 3 bombs were successfully developed. Little Boy, a gun-type fission bomb that worked by firing one chunk
Oh
of
my
uranium into
God,
another.
I don't think I can
Fat
do it.
Man, an implosion-type bomb that worked by compressing a plutonium core to critical mass.
Yes, Elisa
And
is the
Gadget,
one.
a Fat
we
Man
need.
duplicate used as an initial test run. And boy, was it a test. An official test site, codenamed Trinity, had been constructed 200
place.
miles away from Los Alamos to serve as ground zero for the world's first detonation of a nuclear weapon. On July 16, 1945, Gadget was positioned up a 100-foot tall tower to be detonated. Bunkered a hop, skip, jumping away from the tower were 425
Yeah.
spectators, including Oppenheimer. While excited, everyone was still pretty freaking nervous. The scientists weren't exactly certain of what would happen once the bomb was detonated. Would it explode as planned? Would it fizzle out and do nothing? Or would it cause a chain reaction that would obliterate the Earth's atmosphere and allow the sun to burn humanity to a crisp? There was only one way to find out.
Honestly, so hard to see.
At 5:29 a.m., Gadget was detonated and immediately exploded with the force of 25,000 tons of TNT. Almost instantly, the explosion turned the desert sand into a 1,000-foot wide glass crater, generated a shockwave that was felt over 100 miles away, and created a mushroom cloud that stretched 7.5 miles into the sky. He had done it. Oppenheimer and his team successfully created a nuclear weapon, an achievement equally exciting and horrifying. If you're familiar with historical timelines, you might realize that by July of 1945, Nazi Germany had already surrendered, with Japan being the last man standing. Once news of the successful nuclear test reached President Bro Harry Truman, he quickly used it as an open threat to Japan. On July 26, 1945, the US, Great Britain, and China issued the Potsdam Declaration, a document calling for the immediate and unconditional surrender of the Empire of Japan, lest they face prompt and utter destruction. Japan, of course, responded rather quickly,
You're
saying,
free.
so the US was all,
A wild Magikarp appears captured using Poke Catch.
and
Winners
proceeded
revealed
to
in
deliver
90s.
on the threat. On August 6,
Read it.
1945, the first atomic bomb, Little Boy, was dropped on the city of Hiroshima, Japan, a major port and military headquarters. Because it was largely untouched by bombing raids, it allowed for a clear measurement of the before and after destruction of the atomic bomb. The blast directly killed 70,000 people, with almost 90% of those deaths being innocent civilians. Despite
That's
the
fighting
immense
hell's
destruction,
fire,
the
what the hell?
detonation was actually determined to be extremely inefficient, fissioning only 1.7% of its total material. Japan continued to ignore the Allies' demands for surrender, essentially stating that they didn't hear no bell, but they were about to hear something a bit louder.
Oh, Bell, you get
3
it?
days later, on August 9th, the second atomic bomb, Fat Man, was dropped on Nagasaki after the primary target of Kokura was unable to be seen through the clouds. The blast killed 35,000 people instantly. Truman made the tough decision to drop 2 atomic bombs on Japan, but you, on the other
We'll come
hand,
back
have an
to you.
easy decision: to drop 1 like on this video. Truman did have several more atomic bombs lined up if Japan continued to resist, but on August 15th, 1945, Japanese Emperor Hirohito announced his intention to surrender.
そもそも帝国市民の法寧を図り 誰とも君を自分の赴く
So up
と
here
ころ
then.
耐え難きを耐え
World War II
Hi.
was over.
Magikarp escaped. No one
Following
caught
the
it.
war, Oppenheimer was deemed the father of the atomic bomb and was hailed a national hero, becoming the face of nuclear energy. That is, until Truman wanted him to develop a much more deadly hydrogen bomb to use against the Soviets. Oppenheimer was like, no. To which Truman responded, "You're fired, Bob!" and immediately had Oppenheimer's security clearance revoked. After being
What the
politically
fuck?
blacklisted, Oppenheimer hosted
him
scientific
bored.
lectures around the world and warned
Get
others
out
of
of
the
him.
destruction science can have when mixed with politics. Being a heavy chain smoker, he was unsurprisingly diagnosed with throat cancer in 1965 and bit the dust just 2 years later on February 18, 1967 at the age of 62. Oppenheimer's legacy shows the true power of scientific innovation, but how terrifying it can be when weaponized. The bombings of Nagasaki and Hiroshima mark the only time in history that
Yeah.
atomic weapons were used against fellow humans. And for all of our sake,
I'll be
let's
God's
hope
like-
that it stays that way. Or at least until I can max out my old school
Be God's
RuneScape
word.
account.
For honey. Holds. Yeah. No way, that's... No, that is. That
Hey there,
is.
Sleepyhead. You're watching my official compilations channel. If you ever want to watch each
Oh,
video on their
funny.
own, check out the main channel, Chat History. Okie doke, sweet dreams. Ridiculous jobs that no longer exist.
Right, we can make...
In this day and age, we
can make
really
so
take
much
for
money
granted
now.
just how quick and easy it is to be able to communicate. Back in the days of yore, not everyone was rolling around at the speed of sound. It could take several weeks to be able to relay critical information to your buddies, and a lot can change in just a few weeks. Nevertheless, delayed information was better than no information at all, and that's why highly trained long-distance messengers could make or break empires. First used thousands of years ago in ancient times, couriers were the best and fastest form of communication pretty much up until the invention of the telegraph in 1837. Sure, boats and trains made things a tad bit faster, but the principle was pretty much unchanged, physically transporting documents from point A to point B. The earliest and most sophisticated courier system of its time was that of the massive and girthy Achaemenid Empire, also known as, or at least considered to be, the First Persian Empire. They constructed the Angarium, a series of relay stations littered across the Royal Road, the main vein of the empire. This connected two major cities within the empire, Susa and Sardes. Can you deliver this message to Sardes? Yeah, no problem at all.
Nuts.
Sardes, no. The Royal
See, I
Road
knew
stretched
it.
across 1,700 miles of the empire's western half with patrolling guards and security stations at regular intervals, making it heavily secured. I mean, it kind of had to be.
What's that?
Messengers traveling down the road were carrying the orders from the Great King himself, so they were pretty important. Anyone severing or intercepting that line of communication could cause devastating effects. Also at regular intervals were checkpoints. These were relay stations that housed freshly charged horses as well as other messengers ready to pass things along down the line. This system of stations dropped delivery time from roughly 90 days on foot to just 7 to 9 days on horseback. But what if you didn't have horses? Well, we'd have to ask the Inca. Jump forward 2,000 years to the 1500s, and not much has changed in the ways of communication. In fact, one could argue that it was way worse. With no horses around, Incan runners instead relied on their piggies. Messengers of the king,
place?
called the
There's not even
Chasquis,
one
were
place
slim,
you could,
fit, and ready to rip, carrying messages across the vast mountainsides of the Inca Empire. Unlike their
Tarantus.
Persian counterparts, the Inca didn't carry the messages in their pockets, but rather their noggins. And that's because the Inca did not have any formal written language. Wild, right? Instead, apart from some complex numerical systems involving tied knots of string, everything was spoken, so a strong memory was the key to getting the right message across. The Chasquis were tasked with relaying the king's orders to nearby provinces and military commanders. Tell the soldiers that they're doing a solid job and to keep up the great work. Yes, my king. The Inca, though, did rely on relay stations to always have a fresh pair of legs ready to deliver a message. According to Spanish chroniclers, that's a fun word to say, each station was about a half a league apart, but could be as far as 1.5 leagues. That's over 5 miles, or for you metric fellas, over 832,000 centimeters. The stations were more or less weather-resistant small huts with other Chasqui standing about, ready to get a move on. Upon arriving, the first messenger would give the oral performance for his buddies, and then repeat the message that he came with. After memorizing the information, the next Chasqui sprinted up to 5 miles to the next station. Now keep in mind, this was the Inca Empire. It wasn't easily traversed flat road. It was pretty much uphill both ways, wobbly, cobbly stone roads 10,000 feet above sea level, on par with how our parents walk to and from school every day, or so they claim. The king said to slob his knob, and that Greg's a jerk.
What
The fuck did I do? It's unfortunate that sometimes things get lost in translation, but remember the first rule of exchanging information. Never shoot the messenger.
Motherfuckers above.
Leave it to the English to come up with some spooky dooky hocus pocus type stuff. If you're extremely poor and a social outcast with no lucrative or meaningful skills whatsoever, then the profession of Sin Eater might have been on the menu for you.
Hell of a
Historically,
job,
the
eh?
job was performed
Sin
throughout
Eater.
the early 17th century up until the 19th century, mostly
like,
in
that
England,
guy looks
Scotland,
tough.
and
Don't fight
Wales. So just this area. As a Sin Eater,
Damn,
you were
I've
always
never
on
seen
call
that.
for your services, as people have a tendency of kicking the bucket at any given time. So while you sat slapping mud around all day outside your
Mossad.
thatched roof cottage, you could receive the news of a local death
Hey.
at the drop of a hat. Oh, he's dead. A relative or loved one would seek out your services almost immediately after the passing had passed. Once you
Oh,
were summoned,
man.
you'd pull up your britches and tween off screen to convene with the spiritually unclean. Arriving at the door, you politely knock before entering.
Lazy motherfucker.
You waddle inside to see your
Go
new
in.
customer and get to work. So your job as the local sin eater was
job.
to, as you could probably guess,
Oh, wait.
eat the sins of the deceased, as praying and repentance apparently wasn't good enough. Now, the eating of the sins was of course symbolic in nature, but it was conducted in a literal fashion. The family of the dearly departed presented the sin eater with food, usually bread and beer. The food was placed on the chest or face of the individual right as they had passed away, supposedly sucking up all the bad juju as the soul floated to regions beyond. So, now with the food being properly seasoned with a pinch of immorality and a dash of transgression, it was time to chow down. The basic idea of the whole ceremony was that you would effectively
wait
absolve
for
the
this
dead of any
dragon
wrongdoings committed in life, allowing them a clean slate departure for the heavens as a certified good boy. Now you're probably not surprised to learn that this was far from a Michelin star dining experience. The bread was all stale and the beer was warm with a bunch of gross floaties in it. Perfect for the hipsters, but less than ideal for normal people. So after munching and crunching and glugging and chugging, you'd say a quick yet emotionally
Relax.
packed prayer.
The
Rub dub
best
dub,
man
thanks for the grub.
forget.
Yay God.
Where's the shitter?
Now with a proper sense of closure, you'd receive your paltry fee and be
Look at the
promptly
fish.
vacated from the
How did I
premises.
forget about that?
So while your work of purifying
Got
one's
last.
soul was well appreciated, you were looked down upon, even outcasted. The belief was that you'd retain all of these absorbed sins, polluting your own soul in the process. That being the case, sin eaters were forced to live reclusive and isolated lives, being hated, ridiculed, and shunned by the locals. Until it was time to deep throat a sin or 12. It's not exactly clear how the tradition of sin eating was started. Some believe that it derives from the Jewish tradition of the scapegoat, a literal goat that was imbued with all of the local sins and troubles, sent out into the wilderness and actively prodded off a cliff, taking all of the town's trials and tribulations with it. Atonement complete. Thanks, Mr. Goat. As for sin eating,
Well,
it
what's
seems that the
happening?
tradition was finally laid to rest in the beginning of the 20th century with the death of Richard Munslow, the last known sin eater in England. He reportedly was a humble and well-loved farmer who took on the job after the premature deaths of his children. Very sad. All in all,
Sad.
sin eating really was a self-sacrifice when you look at it, trading in any sense of social standing for a few pence. But hey, free bread and beer.
Love and refined gods.
If you thought your childhood was rough, imagine dipping, diving, ducking, and dodging your way through cannon fire while slugging a heavy sack of gunpowder on a ship in the middle of the ocean. That's what powder
You do
monkeys
it.
had to deal with almost on a daily basis. So while you may have been pissed at your mom for taking your Game Boy away for a few days, powder monkeys were grateful if they even saw tomorrow. Back during the Age of Sail, naval warfare was a pretty common occurrence. Ships just blasting big metal balls at each other in hopes of sinking the other guy faster
folks.
or causing enough damage to warrant a surrender. In order to give yourself
Well-
a fighting chance, you needed a well-trained, well-supplied crew who knew their way around cannons. Besides ammunition, the cannons needed a propellant to send those cannonballs barreling at the faces of the enemy. That propellant, of course, was gunpowder. In the heat of battle, every trained sailor needed to man their stations and execute their responsibilities in order to have a decent shot at survival. But one responsibility that didn't need much training outside of carry this shit and run over there was that of supplying powder to the cannoneers. Since there wasn't much to the job description, the task was given to young boys, usually between the ages of 12 and 14. You see, back in this time, between the 16th and 19th centuries, people were just cranking out kids, especially the poor. Simultaneously, nature was just cranking out infectious and deadly diseases, and industry was cranking out fatal working conditions, both of which were promptly streamlining children into the orphanage pipeline. This, of course, caused orphanages to become overburdened, and they needed some relief. And where's the best place to put able-bodied youngsters just looking for any kind of future? The military, of course. European and eventually American navies were scooping up hundreds of impoverished chaps each year and dumping them on ships to take on the role of powder monkey, more often than not against their will. But the young lads were quicker, more agile, and physically smaller than their adult counterparts, making them perfect candidates for the job. During a battle, each boy would quickly carry at least 2 leather cases housing powder cartridges from the ship's powder magazine deep down in the hull, all the way up to the cannons. A dangerous job for sure, but a critical one for the success of the skirmish. Oi lad, bring me that very explosive powder, eh? And be quick about it. Yes sir, right away sir.
Anyway, sir.
That's a good lad. In exchange, the young fellows were clothed, fed, and given beds, even a little bit of education to
Missing
fill
like
their
one.
heads.
Should I
The
do
plan
this?
was to have the boys eventually become official, full-time members of the Navy, assuming that they survived to adulthood. Yet despite the fact that they were a key part of the crew, they held no formal naval rank on the ships which they served. Now, while it was nice to have
Yeah,
a
I
place
gotta
to call
capture
home,
more of
clothes on
those
your back, and
folks.
food in your belly, it of course came with the steep price of witnessing the horrors of war. Just to clarify, I said that powder monkeys were usually between the ages of 12 and 14, but in reality, some were much younger, with some documentation showing cases of children as young as 7 years old. These little
Ew.
guys were subjected to watching their fellow crewmen being blown to smithereens, impaled by split bits of ship, blinded by shrapnel, or having limbs ripped from rogue cannon fire. None of which they were immune to themselves, mind you. It wasn't until the end of the War of 1812 that formal
Good job.
regulations were put in place, preventing any recruitment of powder monkeys under the age of 12 from serving on ships
Put
in the
some
United
stuff out
States.
here.
The British followed in suit with an age limit of 13 for the role, though these age restrictions were
schematics.
still often
Oh my
ignored.
God.
The practice did, however, fully die out in the mid-1800s once child labor laws were put in place and technology made the
Fire
role
as well.
obsolete. Sorry, kids. Looks like it's a big old box of PTSD for Christmas this
Probably
year.
make another shot.
Medieval medicine was wild. Physicians back then were really just throwing anything at the wall to see what stuck, which led to a bunch of strange medical practices that would, luckily, fall out of favor once modern medicine emerged. One such practice was that of uroscopy, the art and science of checking out your pee to determine your health. Now I know what you're thinking. Isn't this still used in the modern day? Yes, but no. Urinalysis, as it's practiced today, uses chemical, physical, and microscopic analysis of urine
wild
samples to
tandem
generate
appears captured
quantitative
using
data for
poke caps.
diagnosis.
Winners revealed in
Uroscopy,
90s.
on the other hand, well, it had dudes snooping, sniffing, and sipping your pee. Well, Doc? I need a second opinion. Now, you might be surprised to know that the practice of uroscopy has been around for thousands and thousands of years. The earliest known evidence that historians have dates all the way back to the 4th millennium BC, where some ancient Sumerian physicians took note of urinary color. Perhaps the most profound early evidence that we have comes from the ancient Egyptians around 1550 BC. This is the Ebers Papyrus, a 65-foot-long medical scroll from ancient Egypt's New Kingdom era. This single document details over 800 diagnoses and remedies for all kinds of conditions ranging from skin problems, eye problems, burns, tumors, a limp, broken bones, backwards teeth, brown parasites, and of course, urinary conditions. The study and examination of urine continued for a while, but the formal occupation of uroscopist is believed to have been introduced between the 4th and 7th centuries in the Byzantine Empire, hitting its peak in the Middle Ages. According to medieval Welsh medical texts, it was believed that urine was the filtrate of the 4 humors: black bile, yellow bile, phlegm, and blood. Of course, we now know that your pee is the product of your kidneys filtering your blood and excess water, but hey, medical science was still a baby back then. Because of this theory, uroscopists believed that
Tandem
urine
ace
was
escaped.
the end
No
all
one
be
caught
all
it.
for determining a person's health status, and thus, it was the most important substance to study. The most telling quality of the urine was its color. So after collecting a fresh sample,
this?
I mean a real fresh sample, the color was immediately observed. But a problem with qualitative analysis is that it's completely subjective, whereas quantitative is objective. When it comes to subjectivity, one PP doctor may interpret the same color differently than another. For objectivity, numbers are numbers. There's no argument there. In order to mitigate subjectivity and establish some sort of consistency, the PIS recipients often constructed quick reference guides to use as a standard for diagnosis, sharing their knowledge across heavily detailed manuscripts. As an example, if your urine was clear, you might have some spleen issues. If it was dark red, your liver's too hot. Green, you've got jaundice. Black, well, wait, is black urine a thing? Oh. Oh God. Yeah, I don't think you're gonna be doing too well if you're inking out your dink. While you had the visual aspect, uroscopists also ventured down the avenues of smell and taste to solidify the reasonings if a diagnosis couldn't be immediately deciphered from color alone. Urine that tasted sweet was evidence of diabetes, whereas stinky pee-pee usually meant infection. Now, while this may seem silly looking at it through a modern lens, there was some validity to the practice. Uroscopists were able to properly diagnose conditions like diabetes and jaundice through their practices. Diagnosis was great and all, but without proper and effective treatment, you're not going to be making much progress, except just being closer to the grave. It's like if someone tells you, hey, your car's broken, and then proceeds to offer no meaningful solution. At that point, they're just taking the piss. The ultra wealthy really love spending their money on stupid shit. They love it, in fact. When you've got more money than you could spend in 50 lifetimes, why not? Dumping the most expensive champagne on luxury watches, a 5th mansion on the beach, rigging elections, whatever tickles their sacks. But ostentatious spending is nothing new. You see, back in the 1700s, wealthy estate owners in England, Ireland, and Scotland were bored out of their skulls. I mean, think about it. The extent of dopamine rushes back then were what?
Right,
Attending yet another opulent ball, hunting some wildlife, racing a horse or two, then putting them down when they don't win. And when you felt like a real degenerate, you had excessive gambling. But these frivolous activities got stale real quick. There needed to be something fresh, something grand, something right in your own backyard. That's when the idea of the English landscape gardens started to bloom, transforming sprawling grounds of estates into picturesque and serene scenes. Replacing the clear-cut and formal gardens of their French counterparts, English landscapes were to appear engineered by nature itself, with natural slopes, ponds, groupings of trees and flowers, a nice boulder or two, and organic decoration. These established wonderful getaways for owners and guests alike to retreat and get in touch with nature. But for some, all the stone and trees and grass just wasn't cutting it. Something was missing, something human, like a person. Believe it or not, some wealthy fellas sought out to hire real-life people as decorations for their gardens. Take, for example, one Joseph Pocklington. Born into a wealthy banking family and receiving his inheritance at just 26 years old, his priority was to just spend the shit out of it. After all, what's the point of having money if you don't spend it? As my dad always tells me, you only live once, son. Enjoy it. Well, Mr. Pocklington over here made damn sure he was going to enjoy the life he was given. After purchasing his own private island on a lake, he commissioned the construction of his own armed fortress, a druid temple, and several natural grottos. In order to make the estate seem more lively, he advertised employment for a man to live in his garden, demanding that the man, quote, live for 7 years without washing or cutting his hair or nails. The man was to never speak or interact with any guests and would spend his lonely days in an artificial cave. The basic idea was for guests to observe a man in his most natural state, untouched by societal influence. If the man was able to carry out these conditions, he would be paid the equivalent of about $100,000 in today's money. Now that's spread over the whole 7 years, so it's not really that much. But the position was dubbed the Ornamental Garden Hermit. Now get this, Pocklington was not the only fella to come up with this idea. Others employed their own hermits with much more lenient rules. Perhaps the most well-known example was the Hill family from Shropshire. Their botanical bro was dubbed Father Francis, and he fully interacted with guests, told stories, and dispensed his own wisdom, all while maintaining a mysterious yet comforting presence.
I want to see the hermit, mummy. I want to see the hermit.
The trend of the ornamental garden hermit lasted just over a century, finally being uprooted in the 1830s in favor of living statues. And to answer your question, no, garden gnomes were not inspired by the garden hermit. Those came from Germanic folklore, hundreds of years prior, but they'll still guard your garden as best they can.
History's most one-sided wars. There's that quote about all being fair in love and war, but I don't think that someone swanging their sword at an Ordnance BL 5-inch howitzer artillery cannon would find it very fair. And that's pretty much what happened during the Battle of Omdurman. Now, if you're familiar with African history around the turn of the 20th century, you know that it was nothing short of a shit show. European powers were grabbing anything and everything they could get their hands on to see what natural resources could be tapped into. As for the British, one of their more tactical moves was seizing control of the Egyptian territory from the Ottoman Empire in the late 1880s. Why Egypt? Well, because Egypt has the Suez Canal, basically a super sweet shortcut connecting the Mediterranean Sea to the Red Sea, and thus the Indian Ocean. Guess who owned India at the time? Also the British. So instead of slogging the freshly plundered raw materials all the way around the scenic circumference of Africa, merchants could just speedrun that shit through the Suez, potentially saving months of sailing. Now, with the seizure of Egypt came a bit of a bonus, some territory to the south, known as Sudan, but it came with some baggage of its own. If Egypt were to be the crisp, clean shirt in the deal, Sudan was going to be the pants. And these pants were about to be shat. So while the British now controlled Sudan on paper, it wasn't really the case in reality, at least not yet. Throwing even more chaos into the mix were the not-so-modest Mahdists, an independent Islamic group that rose up and rebelled against their Ottoman Egyptian oppressors, establishing their own state in the Sudanese territory back when the Ottomans controlled the region just a decade earlier. They didn't give a flying flip that the British were now the technical rulers of the land. Oppressors were oppressors. As a matter of fact, they were feeling a bit big in the britches after just toppling the Ottoman control, so they were eager to start round two. The British, though, initially wanted to abandon Sudan, declaring it too much of a political and financial burden to deal with, what with all the squabbling and whatnot. They would instead leave the Mahdists to have their own land and not intervene. However, continued Mahdist aggression led to the death of one Charles Gordon, a renowned British general who was tasked with evacuating civilians from the Sudanese spit-sounding capital city of Khartoum. Mahdist soldiers slaughtered around 10,000 innocent civilians in the wake of Charles's assassination. This single act switched British opinion from indifference to vowing vengeance. Thus, in 1896, the British began the Anglo-Egyptian conquest of Sudan. This war lasted about 3 years, with British forces steamrolling the Mahdists in virtually every encounter. Well, if it's so one-sided, why did it take 3 years? Good question. This was actually by design. You see, the British were slowly advancing into Sudan, building a supply railroad behind them the whole way so as to not have supplies run dry and be caught with their pants down, an issue that had previously plagued the British in the past. The conquest culminated in the Battle of Omdurman on September 2nd, 1898. Oof, just lasting a single day, huh? Talk about foreboding. Yeah, so this battle wasn't so much of a battle as it was a full-blown massacre. Here's where the one-sidedness kicks in. About 26,000 British and Egyptian troops faced off against over 50,000 Sudanese warriors. Seems like a slam dunk for Sudan, but sheer size is no match for optimal equipment. Remember that supply railway I just mentioned? Well, it supplied the British front lines with 17,000 rolling block rifles, 8,000 bolt-action rifles, 44 artillery cannons, and 40 state-of-the-art water-cooled Maxim automatic machine guns. Oh yeah, there was also a handful of naval gunboats ready to tear shit up from the banks of the Nile. The Mahdists, well, you know, they tried. Well. They had several thousand firearms seized from previous battles, as well as a few dozen artillery, but Yeah, they were either poorly maintained or those operating them were poorly trained. The unlucky fellows not equipped with firearms instead brandished the old reliable sword and shield, and it went just about as well as you'd think. The Mahdists were completely and utterly destroyed. According to 23-year-old British Lieutenant Winston Churchill, yes, that
Oh,
Winston
no, I am
Churchill,
stuck,
approximately
by the way.
11,000 Mahdist soldiers lay dead,
No,
16,000 wounded, and over 4,000 captured. The rest either surrendered or just fled. As for the British, less than 50 soldiers were killed in battle, a testament to the sheer imbalance of weapons technology and tactical warfare. After the battle, the Mahdist state was effectively dismantled, cementing British dominance in Sudan. Sometimes wars can be won without inflicting any real damage. You just have to be well versed in the art of intimidation. Even if you're a tiny pushover, you can still get your way if you make yourself seem scary enough. The Kettle War is a prime example of this tactic. At the end of the 80 Years' War back in 1648, the Dutch gained independence from the Spanish. In addition to establishing their own little republic
did that
within the
happen?
Netherlands, the Dutch had full access to a gaping mouth. The mouth of the Scheldt River. This was a critical trade route for many cities just south of the newly formed republic, cities that were still under smelly Spanish control. So the Dutch took advantage of the situation. Oh yeah, time to close the river. The Dutch cut off all trade access through the Scheldt, completely crippling the economies of the downstream cities. Instead, trade was diverted through the Dutch ports of Amsterdam and Rotterdam, allowing them to flourish into dominant trade hubs. The funny thing though, nothing would be done about it for 136 years. But in the late 1700s, there was a new sheriff in town for the Holy Roman Empire, Joseph II, and he did not like the Dutch doing what they were doing. As a rather ambitious reformer, he was aiming to make his empire the main political and economic power in Europe, but the whole closure of the Scheldt thing was a big old turd in the punch bowl of his plans, so he needed to act, and act he did. Having just gotten their strength kicked in by the British during the Fourth Anglo-Dutch War in 1784, Joseph II decided to take advantage of a now weakened Dutch republic. The demand was simple: open up the river or go to war. Now, when your territory is like this and another territory threatening you looks like this, it might be best to just let them have this one. In reality, however, the Holy Roman Empire's army was fairly scattered across the mainland, being particularly small and ill-equipped near the Netherlands, so the immediate threat was minimal at best. As a show of force though, and to keep up the illusion of strength, Joseph sent out a small squadron of 3 naval warships, led by the heavily armed, no-nonsense having flagship Le Louis. The ships were sent to the mouth of the Scheldt to sit there and look intimidating. The Dutch, however, called the empire out on their bluff. On October 9th, 1784, they intercepted the 3 opposing warships with one of their own, the Dolphin, and it was looking to blow some holes into other ships. In an act of intimidation of their own, the Dolphin fired a single warning shot towards Le Louis. A soup in the morning, a soup at night, a soup every day makes me feel right. Oh man, now I'm super depressed. The warning shot from the Dolphin whizzed through the galley of Le Louis, causing the casualty of a single soup kettle. Hilariously, the crew of Le Louis surrendered immediately, chalking up a victory for the Dutch Republic with a single cannon shot. Joseph II, not to be embarrassed, declared full-on war, but no violence ever came of it. Instead, both agreed to negotiate. The result? The Scheldt remained closed, but the Dutch would compensate the Holy Roman Empire a hefty sum for the inconvenience. Around 2 to 10 million Dutch guilder, or roughly $120 to $600 million in today's money. I'd say that compensates for the soup. My soup. War and drugs is a pretty solid combination, but when said substances are used in warfare, then it becomes a whole other matter entirely. Let's touch back on the early 1800s. Despite being halfway around the world, the British Empire still commanded trade in the Indian Ocean, even stretching into the Pacific, with one of their main suppliers being Imperial China. The Qing dynasty was doling out all kinds of goods to the Brits, including earthy herbs, soft silks, precious porcelain, and the iconic British life fuel, tea. While this trade was good for the British consumer, the rather one-sided trade imbalance left British merchants a tad miffed.
The British Empire was absolutely hemorrhaging silver to pay for all of the goods with no reciprocity. The Chinese simply had little to no interest in British goods like wool or cotton. And that was a problem as British silver reserves were drying up, putting a damper on the liquidity of trade in the region. So what do you do if there's no demand? You force it. The British began secretly exporting Indian-grown opium into Chinese ports. Smugglers paid for the opium with silver, which then paid for more Chinese goods, completing a more sustainable trade loop. British merchants were happy, Chinese smugglers were happy, the majority of the Chinese population were suffering crippling addiction. You know how it goes. So yeah, it's no surprise that opium demand soon turned exponential. From 1797 to 1833, opium imports soared from 680,000 pounds a year to over 5.1 million pounds a year. I mean, it was a silver gold mine. Even American merchants got in on the action, selling Turkish opium to China. But this started to tip the scales too far in the other direction, now with the Chinese silver reserves reaching unsustainable levels, not to mention the effects on the general population. Before, the average British consumer was just sipping their Chinese tea from ornate porcelain cups while relaxing in their comfy silk robes. Now, the average Chinese consumer was struggling to detach themselves from their pipe. Although the Chinese emperor had outright banned opium usage, it didn't stop the average fella from getting their fix. Millions upon millions were addicted, leading to a drastic decline in productive laborers, merchants, farmers, and teachers. Well, in 1839, the Chinese emperor put his silky slippered foot down. Severe punishments were put in place for anyone dabbling in deals of opium. All imports of the stuff were seized and destroyed. Famously, the kickstart of the Opium War was the seizure and destruction of over 2.9 million pounds of opium in one go. The British were not pleased with getting shafted out of payment for the product, so they demanded reparations. At Cannon Point. Just a year later in 1840, a British naval fleet positioned itself off of China's eastern coast and began bringing the heat, bullying various islands into submission as to establish a base of operations. Let's take a look at the roster for both sides. The British in this campaign commanded over 19,000 soldiers and 37 ships. Standing in China's corner, though, was an estimated 100,000 mobilized infantry. China had the numbers, but Britain had the technology. Chinese fortresses? Demolished. Resistance groups? Destroyed. Innocent civilian generational homesteads? Deleted. Campaigning up the Pearl River, the British blasted their way to the Chinese commercial heart of Canton, still hell-bent on getting their compensation. Sir, the British are here. Both parties sat down at a pretty cool-looking table and agreed to peace terms. But the overarching powers in charge, mainly the Qing Emperor and the British Foreign Secretary, refused said terms, prompting the supersaturated British to withdraw from the Pearl and shoot up the Yangtze River to clog any and all economic arteries. This forced China to renegotiate the peace conditions, resulting in the drafting of the Treaty of Nanjing in 1842. As a result, opium usage remained illegal, but new trade ports would be open to British imports, which, hilariously enough, was still royal shit tons of opium. The island of Hong Kong was ceded to the British as a colony, and China was forced to pay nearly 26 million silver dollars in reparations to the British. This comes out to roughly $830 million in purchasing power, or roughly $1.3 billion in silver value alone. Now, there was a second opium war a few decades later, but just like a bunch of farmers winning 2 donkey auctions, the Chinese got their asses handed to them a second time.
You'll ever see.
This one's a classic. Now, I briefly ran through this one in my History Facts You Wouldn't Believe Are True video, but let's revisit it with a deeper understanding and some better artwork. The Anglo-Zanzibar War holds the record as the shortest war in known human history, lasting just 38 minutes. I mean, your commute home is probably longer than that.
You're listening to D101 The Shaft. All other radio stations can suck a dick.
Build a stone wall. We have enough stones, so what am I doing?
The reasoning behind the war was very simple. By the end of the 1800s, Zanzibar was a major trade hub off the eastern coast of Africa. Whoever controlled it had massive influence in the region's exchange of goods, including spices, ivory, and the frequent slave or two, including all profits that go with it.
With European powers scrambling for Africa, Britain needed to cement its ability to control trade, hence the discussion about it taking Egypt in the first chapter. But Zanzibar was also unethically up for grabs. A treaty was signed in 1890, and the nation of Zanzibar, while remaining independent, became a British protectorate, meaning that the British technically held power over Zanzibar, but it could self-govern with guaranteed British protection should things go awry. On August 25, 1896, the British Empire's favorite sultan, along with his esteemed beard, received a sudden and premature ticket to paradise. Some believe he may or may not have been poisoned, but no proof has ever surfaced to support that claim. What's suspicious, though, is that the Sultan's less impressive facial hair having cousin, Khalid bin Bargash, decided to claim the throne for himself while the previous Sultan's body was still warm. Oh, and fun fact, this same guy lost out on the throne just 3 years prior. Highly suspicious, one might say, fingering their mustache. Unfortunately for Khalid, only a British-approved sultan could sit on the throne. Unfortunately for the British, he didn't give a fuck. In case you didn't know, the name Khalid in Arabic means immortal or everlasting, a name that was about to be put to the test using multiple British gunboats just strapped to the tits with cannons and machine guns. On August 26th, the very next day after the Sultan had just died, Khalid was given an ultimatum: surrender by 9 a.m. the next morning or be converted into a fine red mist. Khalid refused, not believing that the British had the balls to actually do anything about it. As a precaution, he had assembled a small army of his own, including a few outdated cannons and guns, but the comparison of firepower was laughable. Multiple warnings were given to the usurper the next morning, up until an hour before the deadline. However, the warnings fell on deaf ears.
Looks like
The
shit.
clock struck the hour, 9 a.m. The air was still with a deafening silence so quiet, you could hear a subscribe button click. The order was given. The gunboats unleashed their volleys on the Sultan's palace for 38 minutes. Suffice to say, it was completely destroyed.
Well, I think you can
After the
see
guns
I'm
fell
not a-
silent,
Oh,
over
shit.
500 men and women, mostly innocent civilians, lay dead. The British suffered only one injury, a simple splinter from flying debris. As for Khalid, he snuck off into hiding but was eventually captured and exiled. That afternoon, the British placed a new approved sultan in place, and within a few weeks, a new palace was built. A happy ending for most. This episode of Chat History is called Emu Wool. Listen, I know the subject has been beaten to death worse than a wife at an alcoholics convention, but now it's my turn. Back in 1932, the inverted hellhole that is Australia had one heck of a problem. After the Great War, returning veterans needed something to help them cope with the fact that they just lived through the most traumatic event of their lives. So far. In order to supply such a remedy, the Australian government encouraged returning veterans to settle on
Nice.
remote farmland out west. This
Oh my God,
relaxing,
this looks
freeing, open-air
terrible.
experience hypothetically would do the mind and body good for the recovering war heroes. But with a lack of farming experience and putting said low-level farmers in less than ideal agricultural conditions, it became way more of a burden than a life of leisure. Oh yeah, and that Great Depression thing was going on. What, you thought that was just a United States thing? No. It was a worldwide catastrophe. To throw even more salt in the wound, wheat prices were taking a pounding. So not only was it a pain to grow, but yielding any wheat, ironically enough, wasn't netting much bread. But then comes the main villain of the story. With environmental, mental, and financial odds stacked against them, the Aussies faced one more foe. The dreaded emu. Bleh. Actually, it was more like 20,000 emus. A massive mob of the flightless birds had migrated from more central regions of the outback towards the west
That'll make
in
it
search
more
of cooler
warmer,
temperatures
man.
and more fruitful areas for public mastication. Unfortunately for the aspiring farmers, such a source of sustenance was their main cash crop. The wheat. The emus swarmed the farmlands, consuming everything in their wake, so the farmers phoned the government. Oi, government! These right cunts are eating on me crops! The news spread quickly, making it all the way up to the Minister of Defense, who approved a military intervention to deal with the pest problem. The solution? A few lead pills administered through an ergonomic dispenser. They were gonna shoot them. Deployed onto the field were 2 Lewis light machine guns with approximately 10,000 rounds and a military vehicle for mobility. The basic idea was to scare off the flocks and send them back where they came from, or at least somewhere that wasn't farmland. But But things of course didn't go according to plan. To make up for the fact that they're flightless, emus are extreme sprinters, capable of topping out at around 30 miles an hour. Also keep in mind that emus can stand as tall as 6.5 feet and weigh over 130 pounds, so these feathered balls of rage were no pushovers. Righto, let's open her up. The emus were slippery little devils, able to weave in and out of the gunfire pretty effectively. They ran around all over the place, tearing up crops in the process. But the real kick in the dick here is that they refused to relocate away from their newfound food source. After a few weeks, only a few hundred emus were slain, barely a dent in the total population. So the government tried again, improving ambush tactics and rallying locals to help out. They were way more successful, bringing the kill count to about 1,000. Still only about 5% of the estimated population. The Australian government threw in the towel, with the public deeming the operation a waste of government resources amidst a global economic crisis. Despite staring down the barrel of a machine gun, the emus were declared the victors. For now. In addition to erecting more effective fencing, the government turned to the everyday citizen for help, providing free or subsidized ammo for some good old-fashioned giant bird hunting. Within just 6 months, over 50,000 bounties had been claimed and paid out, and over the next few decades, this number grew to nearly 300,000. Looks like meat's back on the menu, boys. Embarrassing royal deaths. Part 3.
Look at this. We'll climb up here.
This noble set of nostrils is none other than Charles VIII, the only surviving son of French King Fela, Louis XI. The year is 1483, and thanks to a generous inheritance from his dad's cold corpse, he is now the new French King Fela of France at the angsty age of just 13. But since teenagers aren't the most qualified to rule entire kingdoms, his 22-year-old sister, Anne, took the reins as head of the kingdom until Charles came of age. God, these artists were mean. Now, to her credit, Anne was a pretty solid ruler in her own right, keeping the Kingdom of France afloat for 8 years until Charles's 21st birthday in 1491. She was able to stomp out rebellious nobles and maintain strong royal authority. But now, it was the super schnoz himself up to bat. His first major strategy as King of France was to sign all kinds of peace treaties to make extra super sure that no one was going to invade. After all, the 100 Years' War just ended not that long ago, so he kind of needed some peace of mind. So for a little while, Charles remained on the defensive, until it was time to not do that. If you know geography, you know that just a croissant's throw to the southeast is the Italian peninsula, full of Italians. Around this time, the region consisted of a whole mishmash of kingdoms and republics, with the biggest bit of the boot being the Kingdom of Naples, headed by one King Ferdinand I. He was a dick. So much so that the friggin' Pope of all people encouraged the peaceful Charles to invade and take the kingdom for himself. Side note, Naples once belonged to France, but then Ferdinand's dad, King Alfonso V, yoinked that shit several decades back for the Kingdom of Aragon.
The weirdest
You're following
building
all
ever.
of this, right? So with that plan in his back pocket, the seemingly innocent Pope proceeded to persuade. You like it in Naples? You take it to Naples. Come on, you take it to Naples.
What's he saying about nipples?
Oh. With some questionable encouragement, Charles switched to attack mode, prepping France for full invasion. King Ferdinand, seeing French forces looming on the French horizon, warned his kingdom and allies of the imminent threat before his own departure into the Great Bed Bath and Beyond. In his stead was his son Alfonso II, who tried to reason with the invading Charles, telling him that he could take Milan instead, but leave Naples alone. Well, in 1494, Charles did take Milan. And then everything else. This was the first of many Italian wars. A French government was slammed into place, but just a few months later, the Italian peninsula discovered the power of friendship and drove the French from the land, bringing it all to a net zero outcome. Although all the neighboring kingdoms and such now knew that the Italians were easy pickings. Charles frigged off back to France with the goal of rebuilding his army to slap the shit out of some more Italians, but was never able to do so. Despite his ambitions and yearning to conquer in the name of the crown, the substantial mountain of debt that he just incurred prevented any future conquests.
There we go.
War's expensive after all.
Hey,
So
son,
unable to make
sound
any
like
external
something.
changes, he instead looked
right?
towards the internal, focusing on cultural
A
expansion
wild
and
dragonite appears
pioneering the
captured
French
using
Renaissance.
poke catch,
He
winners
relished in
revealed in
lavish
90s.
architecture, the arts, and sports.
I don't understand
One
why I
particular sport being jeu de paume, or game of the palm. Think tennis, but instead of
That's so
smacking the
dumb.
ball with a sturdy racket, you did it with your bare hand. Charles just loved watching a bunch of dudes whacking their balls around,
Very
but sometimes
comfy.
life's simple pleasures end up cutting that
fix
life
this
short.
here, though.
While heading on over to a match on April 7th, 1498, the king accidentally wanged his melon on a stone frame of a low doorway.
That's a
A
kinda
temporary
dumb
moment of
structure,
embarrassment,
but
but with permanent consequences. The king shrugged it off and continued to watch the game, and everything seemed fine. Until it wasn't. The king collapsed in his seat and fell into a coma. Medical
Oh,
attention
no.
was called right away, but King Charles VIII had died just 9 hours later at the age of 27. He left the Kingdom of France fractured and in massive debt. Now, this little mishap is the king's most cited cause of death, but some modern historians claim that neurosyphilis and epileptic fits may have had something to do with it. Luckily, though, the king had 6 whole kids to carry on the family lineage. Oh wait, they all died in infancy. Bummer.
Bummer indeed.
Little is really known about Duke Qing of Qin, with limited surviving knowledge of his existence being written in ancient Chinese texts, mainly the famous Zhuochuan, which discusses many ancient Chinese historical figures in the context of moral teachings and
Dragonite
symbolism.
escaped.
Well,
No
this
one
poor
caught it.
Duke got the short end of the stick with his life lesson. What we do know about dear old Qing was that he was a prominent ruler in the state of Qin during the Eastern Zhou dynasty, somewhere towards the beginning of the 6th century BC. He was regarded as a strong and wise military ruler, having brought peace and cooperation amongst
Oh,
the
you're
6
feeling.
clans
You're very
within his own
comfy,
state.
that's good.
All he did was divide the state's existing
I mean,
military into
luck
6
pretty
separate
well, I
branches,
think.
one for each of the clans. This kept them happy and loyal, eager to share wisdom and advice on any domestic and foreign affairs to maintain peace. Keep your subjects happy and they won't try to rebel and kill you. Even though he was a man of domestic peace and prosperity, this didn't mean that he couldn't export a few strategic ass whoopings. His strong military coalition allowed the state of Qin to lay some major smackdowns on neighboring warring states during his reign, asserting
Jeez.
dominance within the region. It's just a shame that such a prominent figure would be subject to such a bizarre death. According to the classical Chinese text in the Zhuochuan, Qing was suddenly struck
Oh.
with sickness in the summer of
Down
581
with the
BC.
sickness.
Feeling like complete doo-doo, he consulted with a shaman for advice and a prognosis. And it wasn't good. Instead of any sort of useful medical advice, the shaman instead presented the
Oh,
Duke with a
actually, no.
grim prophecy. You're gonna die, dude. The shaman informed the Duke that he had but a short time to live.
You're gonna die,
Specifically,
dude.
that he wouldn't live to feast on the wheat of the new harvest season. The Duke did not like that, so he had the shaman executed.
Oh,
As a bit of a fuck
Bummer.
you, Qing had some farmers reap an unripe crop of wheat and mash it into flour to make a debatably delicious low poly cake. Horrible idea. The quote unquote cake only exacerbated his symptoms, leading to frequent tummy troubles. Such rumblies in his tumbly meant that he had to make a poopy and a potty. So, scrambling to the nearest possible shitter,
way he
the Duke
says it,
slammed
man.
his cheeks down to make a Duke of his own. But the slamming of the cheeks was apparently overly aggressive
what?
as he fell right through the seat and into the cesspit below.
no.
Already in a weakened state due to illness, Qing was quickly overwhelmed by the rotting slop
Good.
and drowned in the waste. Now, I know what you're thinking. With bizarre deaths such as this, there's often the suspicion of over-exaggeration or falsehoods, with more reasonable explanations for one's passing being brought up in other texts. However, a few other works of the time also mention this exact event, with 0 other sources even alluding to evidence of foul play or even an uneventful natural demise. So Qing is remembered as the Duke that fell into a turlet and done drowned. Pretty shitty.
Let me see what happened.
With a name like Stanislav Leszczynski, you know this guy was destined for greatness, and he was, kinda. During the Great Northern War, Sweden was just frothing at the gash for some faithful allies to assist in their defense against Russia and the aptly named anti-Swedish coalition, one of which was the Kingdom of Poland. The current Polish monarch, King Augustus II, was a cool guy and all, but wasn't very supportive of the Swedes, so let's just... There we go. Stanislav, one of the Polish king's most vocal opposers, had been installed on the throne by Sweden in 1704, and his rule remained valid as long as Sweden remained undefeated in the Great Northern War. The Swedish
know,
got
man.
their fish
Looks so
handed to
dumb.
them in
Looks so
1709, with their king dethroned and forced into exile. With that, Augustus II politely knocked on the
Elizabeth,
Polish royal
no
doors
way.
to reclaim his throne. Sad Stanley was swept to the sidelines, but started to strategize. His beautiful cotton swab of a daughter got hitched to King Louis
minutes
XV of
remaining.
France in 1725, a critical
We'll build
move
our
of
bed here,
politics
actually.
and power. With the French king now giving the old to his daughter, Stanislav would have a stronger claim to the Polish throne when the time came. And just like the French king, that time came rather quickly. In 1733, Augustus II had a bit of an embarrassing death himself. He went and snapped off an entire toe when entering a carriage. The wound got infected, which, in pre-modern medical terms, means death. Now, you would think that the throne would be passed down to Augustus's son, right? Wrong. The Polish king unfortunately never made the throne a hereditary inheritance, which was a grave mistake. Instead, the throne was formally up for grabs through a royal election. The winner, of course, was none other than Stanislav Leszczynski, so he was made king. Again. However, Russia, the winner of the whole Great Northern War thing, objected, demanding that the throne be rightfully passed
Objection.
to Augustus's son. Thus, a new war began, the War of the Polish Succession. French and Russian forces proceeded to blow each other to bits in Austria over who should be the rightful Polish king. 2 years and 88,000 deaths later, the two agreed on a ceasefire and Stan was forced to surrender the throne. But in my opinion, he made out on the deal. He had to give up his kingship, sure, but he was made Duke of the territories of Lorraine and Bar, living a wealthy and peaceful life in the comfy, cozy countryside, actively ruling the territories and writing philosophy in his spare time. But during one of his relaxing evenings of spitting poetic flames onto parchment in 1766, tragedy struck. Clad in his iconic
Let's just
silk
build
robes,
some
the now
stupid stuff.
88-year-old Stanislav nodded off near the fireplace. A rogue spark set his clothing ablaze, waking him up in a panic. The fire seared the old man's already withering flesh, resulting in devastating burns. Luckily, nearby servants rushed in and were able to extinguish the flames, but it was too late. Upon examination by his close friend and personal physician, Stanislav suffered severe burns to the left side of his body.
sorry.
His hand was completely burned to the bone. Being a bit of a big boy, Stanislav's stomach was burned as far as 8 centimeters or just over 3 inches under the skin. Over the next 2 weeks, the ex-monarch was slathered in all kinds of lotions and potions, and he seemed to be on the up and up. But then, of course, came the infection. By the 13th day of treatment, the skin on his hand had slid right off,
Ew.
revealing gangrenous sores. He was covered in oozing, festering, and excruciatingly painful wounds. Medical practitioners did anything and everything in their knowledge and power, but the pain and suffering was just too great. Unable to bear even the slightest movement, Stanislav was transferred to his armchair where he painfully passed on February 23rd, 1766. His territories of Lorraine and Bar transitioned over to French control upon his death, a stipulation that was agreed upon when he became Duke. Word of advice, don't sleep within inches of an open fire unless you want to end up a burnt pile of pus.
Terrible,
Rest
man.
in peace, Stan.
Gotta fix it.
Bela the Bison was a man of great fame whose physical achievements gave him his name. Vigorous strength and tactical skill forced friends and foes to bend to his will. Power he had, but a crown he had not. In a brother's betrayal, he would find himself caught. But blood can be spilled and bond can be broken if you've only the will and the words to be spoken. Now take caution and heed with what was agreed. Your fate will catch up at blistering speed. Heavy is the crown if the throne should be weak, for this king will be lost with a simple squeak. That took me like 20 minutes to write. Anyway, Bela of Hungary was a strong dude, having gained his fame after slapping the socks off of a formidable Pomeranian warrior. No, not the dog, the region. His big brother Andrew was crowned king of Hungary around the year 1046. That was good news for Bela because thanks to the Hungarian rule of fraternal succession, he would be next in line to the throne in case anything happened to his brother, which, of course,
That is
being
it.
king, usually meant that something was going to happen to you. And something did, but not from any foreign entity wishing to grab a piece of that land. It was Bela himself. Andrew had completely circumvented that whole tradition of fraternal succession, revising the rules to instead have the crown passed to his own son.
Daddy, I wish to be king, Daddy.
But Andrew famously offered Bela a
Yeah, that
choice.
was fucking
Take
dumb.
the crown and probably get assassinated, or
It's
take the
okay.
sword and remain a faithful and noble warrior. Bela took the sword, but had no intention of remaining loyal. After gathering a gaggle of groupies who supported his claim, Bela turned against his brother in 1060 and seized the crown for himself. Andrew died. Now king of the castle, Bila got to work, aiming to sweep his whole just stole the crown move under the rug. He gave clemency to any of his brother's supporters in order to build loyalty and trust. But of course, not everyone was happy with the usurper. That Holy Roman Empire just next door was looking a little kerfuffled, having supported Bila's nephew, Solomon, as the true king. Bila had attempted to compromise with the big scary empire, offering the would-be king lordship, but them Holy Romans shot it down. With no peace treaty in the cards, Bila built up his defenses in anticipation of an invasion, but he knew that this would be futile. Just 3 years into his reign, he planned to give up the throne to his nephew amidst political turmoil, but the throne would be lost sooner than expected. In the summer of 1063, the
Actually,
chronically
as
concerned
reflection,
King
even though it
Bila
was
sat
shit,
ever
but I
so
like it.
comfortably on said
I
throne.
like it.
Yep. According to several
I'm gonna
medieval
have a
chronicles,
bath.
including the Chronicon Pictum, a 14th century Hungarian compilation of 11th and 12th century records,
Paul's can
Bila's
see
own
naked.
throne collapsed out from underneath him.
Oh, it should
Was it
be.
sabotage? Karma? Poor craftsmanship? Who knows? Now, he was still alive, but Bila was seriously injured from
Even
the
the
whole
wrong
debacle,
side.
reportedly
see
seeming half
everything.
dead. Well, he became full dead several weeks later, succumbing to his injuries in September of 1063 at the age of 45. That little nephew of his ended up taking back the throne, after it was
Correct.
properly repaired, of course. Archduchess Matilda of Austria didn't really get to accomplish much in her life.
Perfect.
That's because she was only
Can I go in?
18 when she crossed over into the Shadow Realm, unfortunately by her own mistake. And boy was it a doozy. Matilda came from a powerful family lineage. Her grandfather, Archduke Charles of Austria, was a key figure in defeating Napoleon Bonaparte in the Napoleonic Wars. Her great-grandfather, Leopold II, was the brother of Marie Antoinette and the penultimate emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. So she had some huge shoes to fill. Now, unfortunately for Matilda and most noble women throughout history, this usually meant that you were just going to be married off to someone powerful for political gain, which was the case. Matilda was to be betrothed to the Crown Prince of Italy in an attempt to turn down the temperature on some heated relationships between Italy and the newly formed Austria-Hungary, because marriage always helps fix bad relationships. However, these marital celebrations would never come to be. You see, young Matilda was a woman of habit. A bad habit.
Doesn't
Since she
look
lived
good,
in
but-
such a state of stress, she savored the
bit
smoking
green.
of cigarettes. Of course, her father wasn't too keen on this tendency of tobacco dependency, often warning her of the dangers of such a habit. This habit is
Here we go. Let's see
dangerous.
what it is.
He also
Wait,
warned her of the many health risks.
Scale pull up.
There are many health risks. Finally, he had straight up forbidden her from smoking. But all of those foreboding flashbacks didn't prevent the
Fuck is
Archduchess
that?
from indulging.
Dynamo.
One evening in May of 1867, Matilda was getting ready to attend the theater, dressing up in her finest, poofiest, most combustible dress. After fitting into the thing, she fancied herself a tobacco snacky, lighting one up for
Never
a few
seen
quick
this one
drags. Whilst puffing away, her ear holes detected the vibrations of footsteps approaching. Her father's
Damn,
footsteps.
look at how
In a
strong it
panic,
looks
she
like,
carelessly
man.
concealed the cigarette in the back folds of her dress. All ready to go to the theater, my dear? He said in whatever language Austrians speak. Ah,
Seems
very
really
good.
good.
You want
172.
smoking in here, are you? Nein.
Big buff boy.
Okay then, off we go. The poor girl's dress ignited in a roar of flames. Her blood-curdling screams alerted servants who attempt to extinguish the fire. They were successful, but the damage was done. The Archduchess's neck, her back, her arms, and her crack all suffered severe second and third degree burns. She was alive, but in critical condition. Ugh, so no theater. For more than 2 weeks, Matilda
up,
received
buddy.
around-the-clock care for her wounds. Similar to poor Stanisław from before, the medical knowledge at the time surrounding treatment of severe burns remained limited. No more than just lathering ointments and bandages and hoping for healing. The crucial process of removing dead skin and applying antiseptics just wasn't standardized or even practiced yet. This resulted in victims succumbing to deadly infections from the fetid flesh. Matilda's wounds turned gangrenous
Good
as the
job.
infection continued to spread.
There we go.
Despite medical efforts, she died from her self-immolation injuries on June 6th,
Sorry.
1867. Remember, that smoking kills.
A wild bravery
Unless
of
you're
his
smoking a
captured
tender rack of
using
ribs.
poke catch. Winners revealed in 90s.
Maybe here.
The majority of Alexander's life was nothing short of chaotic, and it was in no small part thanks to the events surrounding World War I. Dear old dad, King Constantine I, set a Greek policy of neutrality when Europe was banging away at itself during the Great War. This was neutral on paper, but Constantine's familial ties to the German crown had him leaning in that direction. I mean, he was married to Kaiser Wilhelm's sister for Pete's sake. No need to piss off the in-laws. Instead, he ended up pissing off his own people. His political stance angered the Greek prime minister, who went and tattled to the Triple Entente of Russia, France, and Great Britain. Fearing a new potential enemy, they decided to nip Greece in the bud. In 1917, Constantine was thrown off his throne, surrendering it to his younger, more easily manipulated son, Alexander. Alex regrettably accepted the crown at age 23. You see, even though he was now king, Alex knew that he held no real power. That was instead now transferred to the prime minister. Now viewed as traitors, Alex's family was cast into exile. As for Alex himself, he fled Athens to his family's summer home in Tatoi, which is like right up the road.
I'll be right back.
Seriously, it's like a half-hour drive. But it was here that Alex suffered what he thought was a rather inconsequential wound. Well, he was about to be proven very wrong. While out on a stroll on the palace's property, Alex noticed that his pet dog was getting bullied by one of the palace's steward's pet monkeys. He rushed over to break up the fight, but was intercepted by a second monkey bearing vicious fangs. Macaque! That's right, a Barbary macaque. The monkey chomped Alex right on his chest and on his leg. Luckily, he was able to fend off the beasts, returning home to assess the situation. The bites were small, so Alex wasn't too terribly worried. His wounds were hastily cleaned and dressed, but not properly disinfected.
Are you a male?
You can probably guess where this is going. Just a few meager hours later, Alex developed a crippling fever. The wounds had already developed an infection, and sepsis was beginning to set in. Sepsis, in case you didn't know, is your body's oh fuck response to a severe infection. Your immune system goes into crazy maximum overdrive to fight off said infection, but can very well end up killing you as it tries to save you. Unfortunately for Alex, his doctors could not control his fever and considered amputation of the affected leg to minimize further spread of the infection. Neither doctor wanted the figurative and literal blood on their hands. The king's condition worsened over the following weeks before he finally bit the dust on October 25th, 1920 at the age of 27. Never mess with monkeys. They are no joke.
Milk and egg box.
Yeah, that witch is becoming a real problem. This time, you've been sent into ancient Greece, specifically the classical era. A time of great war and conflict, but also a remarkable leap forward in human civilization. So, can you survive one of humanity's greatest expansions? Or will ancient Greece thermop the floor with you? Let's find out.
Alright, I'm gonna take a break here. Yep. I'll take a little break here. All right. Bye-bye.